The Inquisition was a set of institutions created to monitor, judge, and punish those who were considered deviants from the Catholic faith. It did not emerge suddenly, but was the result of centuries of disputes between religious ideas, authorities, and cultural traditions. Its name comes from the Latin verb inquirere, which means to investigate, and that is the essence of its functioning, to investigate suspicions of heresy, that is, of opinions contrary to the official dogma of the Church. To understand the Inquisition in its complexity, it is first necessary to dispel some myths surrounding it. It was not a single, universal, centralized, and omnipresent tribunal, but rather different institutions, created in distinct periods, with their own jurisdictions and varying ties to political power. There was the medieval Inquisition in the 13th century, directly linked to the papacy. The Spanish Inquisition, founded at the end of the 15th century and controlled by the Iberian monarchy. The Portuguese Inquisition, made official in the 16th century, and the Roman Inquisition, which became the Congregation of the Holy Office. Each had similar procedures, but specific objectives, shaped by local circumstances and by the interests of secular and religious authorities. It is necessary to distinguish between formal inquisitorial tribunals and other practices of persecution. Before the creation of these institutions, entire populations already persecuted religious dissidents, accusing them of witchcraft or crimes against the faith. These actions were not inquisitorial in the legal sense, but rather lynchings and spontaneous persecutions, often encouraged by local preachers or secular leaders. What the Inquisition did was to institutionalize this impulse, offering a structured process with rules, written records, formal interrogations, and sentences that had to follow predefined steps. In this way, it differed from disordered violence, even though the final result was often equally brutal. Another central point is the relationship between the Inquisition and secular justice. The Church could declare a defendant guilty of heresy, but it did not directly apply the death penalty. The execution, generally by burning at the stake, was the responsibility of the so-called secular arm, that is, the civil authorities. This created a symbiosis between spiritual power and political power. The Church decided who was a heretic, and the state carried out the sentence. Thus, the Inquisition was never just a religious instrument, but also a political one, used to consolidate monarchies, control minorities, and affirm the authority of rulers. This intertwining made it a phenomenon of great historical impact, as it united dogma and politics in the same mechanism of social control. Another common misconception is to imagine that the Inquisition was dedicated exclusively to witchcraft. Although there were trials against people accused of magical practices or of making pacts with the devil, the greater focus was on the surveillance of Christian dissidents, the Cathars and Waldensians in the Middle Ages, the Conversos and New Christians in the Iberian Peninsula, the Protestants in times of Reformation, and the Enlightenment thinkers in the 18th century were the main targets. Witchcraft entered the inquisitorial radar in specific moments, but it was not the core of the institution. On several occasions, inquisitors even showed skepticism in the face of exaggerated accusations of witchcraft, preferring to focus on religious offenses considered more dangerous to the unity of the faith. It is also essential to separate the Inquisition from the stereotypes created later. The so-called Black Legend that spread from the 16th and 17th centuries onward, mainly by political enemies of Spain, described the Inquisition as a sea of unlimited cruelties. This propaganda had a real basis, since there were tortures and executions, but it was often exaggerated for diplomatic and ideological purposes. At the same time, Catholic apologists minimized or tried to justify the abuses, describing the Inquisition as a necessary and even merciful institution. The historian's challenge is to balance these discourses, analyzing original documents and processes to reconstruct a more faithful picture, neither demonized nor idealized. Another aspect that deserves clarity is the notion of heresy. It was not only about disagreeing with a theological opinion, but about breaking with the unity of the Christian body. Heresy was seen as a social threat, as it endangered not only individual salvation, but also collective order. The heretic was described as a cancer within the community, which needed to be cured or excised. Hence the insistence on public penances, abjurations, and even executions. The logic was to preserve the purity of the community of the faithful. This conception explains why the Inquisition became so rigorous in times of crisis, when the unity of the faith was considered a condition for the survival of the entire society. The Inquisition must also be understood in its time. In the medieval and modern world, religious intolerance was the rule, not the exception. Protestant states after the Reformation also persecuted Catholics, Jews, and dissidents. The wars of religion between the 16th and 17th centuries cost millions of lives across Europe. In this context, the Inquisition was not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a broader logic in which religion and politics were inseparable. Even so, its institutionalization and longevity made it one of the most emblematic examples of organized repression. Finally, understanding what the Inquisition was not is as important as understanding what it was. It was not a universal tribunal, nor exclusively medieval, nor solely dedicated to witchcraft. It was, rather, a network of institutions with roots in the theological thought of the Church and branches in political power, capable of shaping entire societies and leaving a lasting mark on collective memory. From this conceptual basis, we can advance to its origins, its institutional evolution, and its impacts in Europe and the world. The understanding of the Inquisition requires delving first into its theological basis, for it was not only a juridical or police mechanism, but a practical extension of fundamental concepts of medieval and modern Christianity. The idea of heresy, understood as a deliberate deviation from the faith considered true, was seen not only as an intellectual error, but as a spiritual disease capable of contaminating the entire community. For the mentality of the time, Christian society formed a single mystical body, and anyone who strayed from orthodoxy endangered collective salvation. Therefore, heresy was not treated merely as a personal sin, but as a crime against God, against the Church, and against social order. This thought was rooted in biblical passages and in patristic tradition, which compared the heretic to a gangrenous member that needed to be healed, or, in the last case, amputated to preserve the rest of the body. The concept of orthodoxy functioned as the opposite measure. Orthodox, from the Greek orthos, correct, and doxa, opinion or belief, meant being aligned with the official doctrine defined by the Church. Orthodoxy was not static, as it developed through councils, papal decrees, and theological interpretations that accumulated over the centuries. However, in each period, there were points considered non-negotiable, such as the divinity of Christ, papal authority, the sacraments, and the belief in the unity of the Church. Breaking with these pillars was equivalent to harming the very essence of Christianity, according to ecclesiastical mentality. The defense of orthodoxy, therefore, was seen as a sacred mission, a duty not only of clerics but of all the faithful. Within this system, penance assumed a central role. Since the earliest centuries, the Church saw confession and penance as paths to repair the guilt of sin. The heretic, once identified, had the chance to repent, confess, and accept a penance that could include fasting, pilgrimages, public flagellations, or the use of the sambenito, the infamous garment that marked the penitent before the community. Penance in this context was not only a spiritual act but also a social one. It publicly demonstrated the return to order and submission to the authority of the Church. This emphasis on repentance explains why inquisitors often preferred reconciliation over execution, although severity increased in the face of relapse or obstinacy. Excommunication was another crucial instrument. By cutting someone off from the communion of the faithful, the Church not only spiritually isolated the individual, but also placed them in a position of social and legal vulnerability. The excommunicated could not participate in sacraments, lacked full legal protection, and often lost civil and economic rights. This isolation created enormous pressure for confession and reconciliation, as no one wished to live marginalized in a society where religion permeated all aspects of daily life. Excommunication was, therefore, a powerful weapon of spiritual and social coercion. Reconciliation was the next stage, when the repentant was readmitted into the bosom of the Church after fulfilling their penance. This reintegration did not completely erase the stigma, but it restored the possibility of salvation. In a world where hell and eternal damnation were real and constant fears, the promise of reconciliation was a strong incentive for submission. The Inquisition, in this sense, was not only repressive but also therapeutic according to its own logic. It offered the remedy of penance to heal the deviated soul. This conception was part of a collective spirituality in which religious discipline was understood as a way to preserve not only social order, but the eternal destiny of the entire Christian community. The sacrament of confession, formalized at the Council of Lateran in the year 1215, strengthened this mechanism even more. The obligation of annual confession and the requirement to declare sins to the priest created an unprecedented network of spiritual surveillance. The confessor, by hearing sins and signs of heresy, became a key figure in detecting deviations. This intimate control over the individual's conscience allowed the Church not only to guide morally, but also to gather valuable information to maintain orthodoxy. Confession was presented as an act of mercy and forgiveness, but in the inquisitorial context, it also became an instrument of suspicion and denunciation. The theology of the time justified this repressive structure based on two complementary ideas. Eternal salvation was the supreme good, and heresy threatened this good. Therefore, repressing heretics was considered a form of charity, as it prevented more souls from being led astray. Thus, paradoxically, the severity of punishments was defended as an act of love for one's neighbor. This logic, incomprehensible to modern values, made sense in a society that believed literally in heaven, hell, and eternal damnation. It was better to punish some severely according to this mentality than to allow many to be lost forever. Another theological support came from the comparison between spiritual power and temporal power. Just as the state punished thieves and murderers to protect public order, the Church considered it legitimate to punish heretics to protect spiritual order. The crime of heresy was equated with treason, and treason against the faith was seen as worse than treason against a king, for it offended the divine sovereign. This equivalence made heresy one of the gravest possible offenses and provided the basis for the use of extraordinary methods in investigation and punishment. These foundations show that the Inquisition cannot be understood as a mere institutional excess or as the whim of rulers. It was the logical consequence of a theology that saw faith as the absolute foundation of collective life. From this matrix, each procedure, each penance, and each sentence was part of a larger mechanism aimed at preserving the spiritual unity of Christendom. This mechanism, however, was not restricted to theory. It materialized in real history, shaping entire societies. To understand the emergence of the Inquisition, it is indispensable to observe the European panorama prior to the 13th century, when the Church had not yet created centralized tribunals for the repression of heresy. This period was marked by intense social, religious, and political transformations that prepared the ground for the institutionalization of mechanisms of spiritual vigilance. Western Christendom was expanding, consolidating monarchies, rapidly urbanizing, and with this came multiplying tensions among different forms of religiosity. In this context, dissident movements such as the Cathars and the Waldensians flourished, questioning ecclesiastical hierarchy and sacramental practices. The reaction to these groups inaugurated not only violent persecutions, but also the construction of a juridical vocabulary that would come to underpin the Inquisition. The Cathars, also called Albigensians, constituted the most well-known movement and the most feared by contemporaries. Their dualist theology defended that the material world was the work of an evil principle, while the spiritual world came from good. This vision led them to reject Catholic sacraments, to consider the ecclesiastical hierarchy corrupted, and to propose an austere lifestyle for their leaders, called the Perfect Ones. Cathar preaching attracted crowds, especially in the south of France, where dissatisfaction with the local clergy was intense. The success of this movement represented a real threat to papal authority, as it created a parallel church, organized and expanding. The church's response was harsh. In the year 1209, Pope Innocent III called the Albigensian Crusade, a military campaign that lasted about 20 years and devastated entire regions of Languedoc. The crusading discourse, previously directed toward the Holy Land, turned inward to Christendom itself, justifying the extermination of heretics in the name of preserving the faith. This war not only destroyed Cathar communities, but also reinforced the idea that heresy should be fought as a military and existential enemy. It was in this climate of repression that the first systematic procedures of investigation were born. a prelude to what would become the Inquisition. Another significant movement was that of the Waldensians, initiated by Peter Waldo in Lyon at the end of the 12th century. Unlike the Cathars, the Waldensians did not deny the sacraments, but criticized clerical ostentation and preached evangelical simplicity. They defended the reading of the Bible in the vernacular and preaching by laymen, practices that collided with ecclesiastical authority. Although they were not initially heretical in doctrine, their refusal to submit to Roman hierarchy quickly placed them under condemnation. The Council of Verona in the year 1184 already classified them as heretics, showing how the Church did not tolerate autonomous movements that threatened its monopoly over religious discourse. These movements did not arise in a vacuum. The growth of cities, social mobility, commerce, and the circulation of ideas created fertile ground for new spiritualities. Itinerant preachers attracted crowds, offering simple answers to complex problems, while the institutional church struggled to maintain its authority. Popular dissatisfaction with clerical corruption and with the distance between evangelical message and ecclesiastical practice fueled these dissidences. At the same time, monarchy and feudal lords saw them as political risks, since religious fragmentation could shake social order. In this scenario, the Church began to develop a juridical vocabulary to deal with heresy. Already in the 12th century, councils such as that of Tours in the year 1163 and that of Verona in the year 1184 established that bishops had the obligation to investigate suspects of heresy in their dioceses. This obligation marked the passage from sporadic repression to systematic vigilance. The document Ad Abolendum from the year 1184, considered one of the founding milestones of the juridical struggle against heresy, determined that heretics and their protectors would be punished with excommunication and handed over to secular authorities for harsher sanctions. This articulation between church and state foreshadowed the inquisitorial logic that would be consolidated in the following century. Another important element was the introduction of the concept of infamy, applied to heretics and all those who supported them. Being declared infamous meant losing civil rights, not being able to occupy public office, and living under permanent stigma. This juridical penalty transformed heresy into a crime with broad social repercussions, far beyond the spiritual field. Canon law during this period began to incorporate specific provisions against dissidents, shaping a legal apparatus that would provide a solid base for inquisitorial activity. Repression was also legitimized with the discourse of the unity of the faith. At a time when religion and politics were inseparable, religious fragmentation was seen as a threat to the very survival of Christendom. Thus, combating heretics was equivalent to defending not only the purity of doctrine, but also social cohesion and the authority of rulers. This reasoning justified the use of violence, confiscation of goods, and even military exterminations. What was at stake was not only the salvation of souls, but the preservation of an order considered divinely instituted. These antecedents show that the Inquisition was not born of a sudden whim, but from a gradual process of institutionalization of intolerance. The experience with Cathars and Waldensians demonstrated that it was insufficient to rely only on preaching or military repression. It was necessary to create specialized tribunals with their own rules and papal authority to vigilantly and continuously correct deviations. From this crucible of religious conflicts, internal wars and juridical innovations, the Papal Inquisition emerged, formalized from the year 1231 with Pope Gregory IX. The institutionalization of the Papal Inquisition occurred in the 13th century as a direct result of the experience of repression against heretical movements, especially the Cathars and the Waldensians. In the year 1231, Pope Gregory IX officially created the first inquisitorial tribunals, giving rise to a system that would become known as the Medieval Inquisition. This new structure aimed to transfer the responsibility for investigating heresies from local bishops to specialized agents, invested with papal authority. This change represented not only a reinforcement of the centralization of the Church, but also an innovation in the way Christianity began to deal with dissent. The choice of who would exercise the role of inquisitor was not random. Gregory IX entrusted this mission mainly to the mendicant orders, especially the Dominicans and Franciscans. These religious men were seen as more prepared to combat heresy, for they combined austere lives, effective preaching, and solid theological knowledge. The Dominicans, in particular, gained prominence as their order had been founded with the mission of preaching against heretics in southern France. From then on, the inquisitors became direct representatives of the Pope, with powers to investigate, interrogate, and judge cases of heresy in the name of the universal Church. This position gave them considerable autonomy, greater than that of many bishops, which generated tensions and jurisdictional disputes. The functioning of the medieval Inquisition followed well-defined stages. The inquisitor arrived in a city, preached a sermon, and announced the so-called Edict of Faith, a document that summoned all the faithful to denounce suspects of heresy. During the period called Grace, those who voluntarily confessed their deviations received lighter penalties, usually spiritual penances. Those who were denounced, however, were subjected to a formal process, which included interrogations, the collection of testimonies, and written records. This bureaucratic aspect was one of the great innovations of the system. Each case was documented in detail, creating archives that today allow historians to reconstruct the inquisitorial logic. The penalties varied according to the gravity of the case. They could range from fasts and pilgrimages to life imprisonment or delivery to the secular arm for execution. It is fundamental to remember that the Church did not directly execute those condemned to death. Instead, it declared them relapsed and handed them over to civil authorities, who carried out the capital sentence, generally by burning at the stake. This formal separation between church and state created an appearance of distinction, but in practice, it was a joint mechanism. Spiritual power judged and defined heresy, and temporal power applied the harshest sentence. Torture, although formally regulated only later, already appeared as a resource in the 13th century. Authorized in the year 1252 by Pope Innocent IV through the bull Ad Extirpanda, its use was supposed to be restricted and controlled without causing mutilation or death. However, in practice, limits were often exceeded. Torture was justified as a means of extracting confessions, considered fundamental proofs in the process. This authorization revealed the logic of the time. The truth of the faith was so vital that it justified exceptional methods of investigation. To guide the inquisitors, manuals emerged that systematized practices and doctrines. The most famous was the Practica Inquisitionis Heretics Pravitatis, written by Bernard Gui at the beginning of the 14th century. This manual described how to identify heretics, how to conduct interrogations, and how to apply sentences. Bernard Gui, who worked in southern France, recorded hundreds of cases and became one of the best-known inquisitors of his time. His work is testimony to the rationalization of the inquisitorial process. Each stage was carefully defined, from the first sermon to the final penalties. This demonstrated the transformation of repression into a true science of faith, with methods, rules, and patterns repeated in different regions. The work of the inquisitors, however, was not always received peacefully. Many communities resisted their arrival, and conflicts with local authorities were frequent. Bishops, who had previously held the monopoly of judging heresies, found themselves deprived of part of their power. Kings and feudal lords also resented the autonomy of the inquisitors, for they acted in the name of the Pope, often regardless of secular interests. There were cases of popular rebellions against inquisitors, such as the assassination of Peter of Verona in the year 1252, later canonized as a martyr of the faith. These episodes reveal that the medieval Inquisition was not an uncontested machine, but an instrument constantly negotiated with different social and political forces. Another element that deserves attention is the pedagogical character of punishments. The autos da fe, although more spectacular in later centuries, already had their origin in this period. Sentences were public, pronounced before the community, with the purpose of intimidating and instructing. The condemned served as an example for others, reinforcing the message that heresy would not be tolerated. The spectacle of punishment, therefore, had a symbolic value as important as the juridical aspect. Between the 13th and 14th centuries, the Inquisition spread through several regions of Europe, especially France, Italy, and Germany. In each place, it adapted to local circumstances, but always maintained the central logic, continuous vigilance of the faith, and systematic repression of deviations. Its presence consolidated papal power and reinforced the idea that religious unity was a condition for political and social stability. By the end of this period, The Inquisition had already established itself as a permanent institution, ready to expand and transform in the following centuries. The functioning of the medieval and modern Inquisition can only be fully understood when we analyze its procedural stages. Unlike the secular justice of its time, the Inquisition created a model that combined spirituality, canon law, and unprecedented juridical techniques to deal with what was considered the gravest of crimes, heresy. This process not only investigated and punished, but also disciplined the Christian community, turning each trial into a public example of the control of the faith. Everything began with the edicts, which could be of grace or of faith. The Edict of Grace was an announcement made by the Inquisitor upon arriving in a given locality. In this document, usually read in a public sermon, he offered a limited period of time, which varied between 15 and 30 days, for suspects of heresy to voluntarily confess their deviations. Those who presented themselves within this period received mild penalties such as fasts, pilgrimages, wearing the San Benito or public prayers. The idea was to allow reconciliation and to encourage denunciation, since those who confessed often also gave the names of accomplices. This stage had a strong pedagogical character. While it offered mercy, it instilled fear of harsher punishments for those who remained hidden. Once the period of grace had passed, the Edict of Faith came into effect. In this case, all the faithful were summoned to denounce anyone who had behaviors or beliefs considered heretical. Omission was also punished, because silence in the face of heresy was seen as complicity. Denunciations could be made anonymously, which generated a climate of constant mistrust within communities. Neighbors, workmates, and even family members denounced one another, often out of fear, revenge, or economic interest. The system of anonymous denunciations created an environment of permanent social surveillance, in which each individual was at once suspect and overseer of others. Once the denunciations were received, the Inquisitor initiated the secret inquiry. This stage was conducted with great formality. Testimonies were recorded in writing and kept under seal. The accused rarely had access to the names of their accusers, which made their defense difficult. This secrecy was justified as a protective measure to avoid reprisals against informers, but it also served to keep the defendant in a position of fragility. The inquisitorial process was thus distinguished by its asymmetry. While the accusation counted on institutional support and the cloak of anonymity, the defendant faced great difficulties in fully defending themselves. The production of evidence followed a particular logic. Confession was considered the strongest proof, which is why many efforts were employed to obtain it. When there was no spontaneous confession, the authorities resorted to testimonies, presumptions, and indications. Small signs such as failing to fulfill religious rituals, possessing forbidden books, or having contact with people already condemned could be used as evidence of heresy. Torture, authorized from the middle of the 13th century onward, was applied as a last resort to extract confessions. Although there were rules that limited its use, such as not repeating the torment or not causing permanent mutilations, in practice, these restrictions were often ignored. The value given to confession made torture become central to the inquisitorial process, even though in official terms it was considered exceptional. Another characteristic element was the oath. The accused, when interrogated, was obliged to swear to tell the truth about themselves and about others. This oath bound their conscience to God, and lying was seen not only as a procedural crime, but as a grave sin. The spiritualization of the oath increased the psychological pressure on the defendant, who feared both earthly condemnation and eternal condemnation. In addition, inquisitors could demand oaths from witnesses and even from entire communities, reinforcing the collective character of vigilance. Abjurations were central moments of the process. When the defendant admitted their error or accepted the accusations, they performed a public ceremony of abjuration in which they formally renounced heresies and promised to obey the Church. This abjuration could be light, serious, or vehement, depending on the gravity of the case. In more severe situations, it was carried out before crowds, serving as a pedagogical spectacle. The defendant, dressed in the San Benito, was displayed as an example of repentance and submission. If they relapsed after the abjuration, however, the penalty was almost always death, because obstinacy was considered the worst of faults. The inquisitorial process thus had a double objective. On the one hand, It aimed to correct and reintegrate through penance and abjuration. On the other hand, it sought to eliminate the irrecoverable by handing them over to the secular arm for execution. This combination of mercy and severity was coherent with the theology of the time, which viewed heresy as a disease to be cured or an evil to be extirpated. Each stage, from the edict to the sentence, reinforced the idea that the faith needed to be constantly watched and purified. Beyond disciplining individuals, the inquisitorial process had a community function. Sermons, edicts, auto da fe, and public penances created an environment in which everyone was reminded of the need for orthodoxy. Fear, shame, and the possibility of reconciliation functioned as the gears of one and the same system, capable of keeping entire societies under permanent spiritual and social control. The logic of the Inquisition was based on the idea that heresy was, above all, a spiritual disease that needed to be cured, but that in cases of obstinacy or relapse, it became an irreversible threat to the Christian community. This understanding defined the gradation of the penalties applied, which could range from the simple act of spiritual penance to the handing over of the condemned to the secular arm, culminating in their public execution. The process, therefore, was not limited to individual punishments. Each penalty had a pedagogical value, projecting to the entire society the message that Orthodox faith was non-negotiable. The spiritual penalties were the mildest and aimed to correct and reintegrate the defendant. They could include prolonged fasts, daily prayers, pilgrimages to sanctuaries, the use of corporal disciplines, and even the obligation to carry crosses during religious ceremonies. One of the best known was the use of the sambenito, a tunic of coarse fabric, usually yellow, decorated with crosses and inscriptions that identified the condemned as a penitent of the Inquisition. This garment was not limited to the public act. In many cases, the condemned was required to wear it for months or years, transforming their daily life into a walking confession of guilt. The sambenito exposed the individual to shame and social stigma, affecting their reputation, their business, and even their descendants, since infamy extended to the family. Public penances were another essential resource. The defendant could be required to attend religious ceremonies, listen to special sermons, carry lit candles before the community, or participate in processions dressed in the sambenito. These practices functioned as rituals of humiliation, but also of reintegration, for they marked the return of the penitent to the bosom of the church after their confession. From the inquisitorial perspective, they were visible manifestations of the victory of orthodoxy over error and dissuasive examples for the other faithful. However, not all defendants received light penalties. When the Inquisition considered that heresy was deeply rooted, or when the accused relapsed after having abjured, the penalty became much more severe. In this case, the tribunal declared the defendant relapsed and handed them over to the secular arm. This transfer was a key point. The Church, in theory, did not shed blood, maintaining the discourse that its mission was spiritual. The execution, however, was conducted by the state in the name of public order. This division of roles created the appearance of separation between church and physical violence, but in practice, it was a joint mechanism. The secular arm applied the capital punishment, which was usually death by fire. This method had a powerful symbolism. Fire was seen as purifying, capable of destroying the contaminated body and at the same time preserving the community from heretical contagion. The stake was also a collective spectacle, with thousands of people gathered to watch, reinforcing the pedagogy of punishment. The execution was not only a punishment, but a public act of reaffirmation of orthodoxy and submission to religious and political order. There were, however, intermediate gradations between spiritual penance and death. Some convicts were sentenced to life imprisonment in dark and unhealthy cells, with a regime of severe isolation. Others were condemned to the confiscation of goods, which served both as a form of economic punishment and as a means of financing the inquisitorial tribunals themselves. This practice had profound repercussions. Entire families could be ruined, inheritances were confiscated, and properties passed into the hands of the church or the state. Confiscation, besides being a punishment, was also an instrument of social and political control. The distinction between spiritual and corporal penalties was rooted in the theology of the time. Spiritual penance aimed to save the soul, correcting and reintegrating it. Corporal punishment applied by the secular arm had the role of eliminating the irreparable threat and protecting the community. This duality was seen as complementary and necessary, reflecting the conception that divine justice also manifested through earthly order. The social effects of these punishments were lasting. The stigma of having a relative condemned by the Inquisition could mark generations. Families of new Christians, for example, suffered from the infamy that was perpetuated in documents and records. Many sought to erase this past, but the Sambenitos and lists of the condemned were posted in churches, ensuring the memory of guilt. Thus, inquisitorial punishment went beyond the individual, affecting entire lineages and shaping social relations over centuries. The public ceremonies of condemnation, known as autos da fe, were the culmination of this punitive system. They brought together crowds, involved processions, sermons, and the reading of sentences before the community. The defendants were displayed in specific garments, their faults were proclaimed, and their penances executed before all. In the most serious cases, the handing over to the secular arm took place immediately, with execution at the stake before the same crowd. These autos were spectacles of power, in which church and state united to reaffirm their authority. Therefore, inquisitorial penalties cannot be seen only as individual punishments, but as instruments of collective discipline. They combined humiliation, pedagogy, economic destruction, and physical violence in a system aimed at preserving orthodoxy and ensuring the submission of society. This logic of graded penalties, articulating mercy and severity, was one of the pillars that sustained the longevity of the Inquisition and consolidated its presence in the historical memory of the West. Torture occupies a central place in discussions about the Inquisition, for it symbolizes the contradiction between the spiritual mission of the Church and the violent methods used to maintain orthodoxy. Although it was not invented by the Inquisition, it was incorporated in a systematic way from the 13th century onward and became one of the most remembered aspects of its judicial practice. Its application was not arbitrary. There were canonical norms that defined when and how it could be used, theological justifications for its use, and meticulous records of each session. However, the boundaries between theory and practice were often blurred, which gave rise to historiographical controversies that persist to this day. The initial legal milestone was the bull ad extirpanda, promulgated by Pope Innocent IV in the year 1252. This document explicitly authorized the use of torture to extract confessions in heresy proceedings, provided that certain limits were respected, not causing death, not provoking permanent mutilations, and applying it only once. The bull sought to legitimize the method, arguing that heresy was a crime so grave against God and against the Christian community that it justified exceptional means of investigation. The intention was to place torture within legal parameters, removing it from the realm of improvisation and subjecting it to rules. In theory, the inquisitor could only resort to torture in cases of strong suspicion against the accused, when there were indications but not sufficient proof for conviction. In addition, it was to be used as a last resort, after the possibilities of obtaining a voluntary confession had been exhausted. The defendant had to be formally warned that they would be subjected to torment, and their subsequent confession had to be confirmed outside the torture session in order to be valid. These norms revealed the attempt to give the appearance of justice to a method that, in practice, placed the defendant in a position of extreme vulnerability. The instruments used varied according to region and time, but some were common. The strappado consisted of suspending the accused by the arms tied behind the back, causing intense pain in the joints. The rack was a trestle on which the body was stretched to the limits of endurance. There was also the use of tightened ropes, pulleys, fire, and even sleep deprivation. In all cases, the objective was not to kill, but to inflict sufficient suffering to break the defendant's resistance and force them to confess. Psychological terror was also part of the process. The mere threat of torture already led many to confess. From a theological point of view, torture was justified by the gravity of heresy. If the heretic put at risk the salvation of the entire community, it was considered legitimate to use extraordinary methods to reveal the truth. Some theologians argued that physical pain could free the soul from error, functioning as a temporary purification. Others compared the practice to the action of the secular state, which punished criminals to protect public order. In this reasoning, Torture was seen as a proportional measure in the face of the spiritual danger represented by heresy. Inquisitorial records show that torture was indeed used, but not in all proceedings. In many cases, the accused confessed before reaching that point, whether out of fear or because of social pressure. Even so, the recourse to torment became a structural part of the system and was etched in collective memory as its most brutal mark. There are reports of people who endured sessions without confessing, others who confessed under pain and later tried to recant, and still others who invented names of accomplices to end the suffering. This created a problem for the inquisitors, because confessions obtained under torture were often imprecise or false, yet they still served as a basis for convictions. Modern historiography debates the frequency and intensity of torture in the Inquisition. Some researchers, based on original documents, argue that it was used less than is imagined, and that the anti-Catholic propaganda of the 16th and 17th centuries, the so-called Black Legend, exaggerated its importance. Others maintain that even if it was not applied statistically in all proceedings, its mere existence created a climate of permanent fear and conditioned defendants to confess even before reaching torment. The truth is probably between these poles. Torture was not universal, but it was sufficiently present to mark the inquisitorial experience deeply. The practice also generated moral dilemmas within the Church itself. Some jurists and theologians questioned to what extent a confession obtained under pain could be considered valid. Others warned about abuses, when inquisitors ignored the established limits and applied torments repeatedly. These criticisms show that, although officially legitimized, torture always carried a weight of ambiguity, reflecting the tension between the ideal of salvation and the reality of violence. In popular imagination, however, it fixed itself as the absolute symbol of the Inquisition, the image of the defendant stretched on the rack, screaming under the watch of implacable monks, crossed the centuries as the representation of the court's cruelty. Literature, art, and cinema reinforced this association, even when it did not correspond exactly to documentary reality. This symbolic persistence reveals how torture became more than a judicial technique. It turned into a metaphor for religious repression and institutionalized intolerance. Therefore, torture in the Inquisition must be understood in its complexity. It was not an exclusive invention of ecclesiastical tribunals, nor was it applied indiscriminately in all cases, but it was theologically legitimized, legally regulated, and used as an instrument of coercion in a significant number of proceedings. Its existence, more than its exact numbers, shaped the perception of the Inquisition as an institution that reconciled faith and violence, mercy and brutality, revealing the profound contradiction between its spiritual objectives and the earthly means employed to achieve them. The Spanish Inquisition, officially instituted in the year 1478, represents one of the most emblematic and long-lasting chapters in the history of religious repression in the West. Unlike the medieval Inquisition, which was under the direct control of the papacy, this new institution was born from a singular agreement. It was created by the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, with papal authorization, but it remained from the beginning under the command of the Spanish crown. This characteristic turned it into a powerful political tool used to shape religious unity and at the same time to reinforce monarchical centralization. Its activity extended until the year 1834, making it one of the longest-lasting and most influential expressions of the Holy Office in Europe. The context of its foundation is linked to the process of unification of the Iberian Peninsula. Ferdinand and Isabella, when marrying in the year 1469, united the two main Christian crowns of the peninsula and began an ambitious project of territorial and spiritual consolidation. The reconquest was advancing against the Muslim kingdoms, and in the year 1492, Granada would finally fall, marking the end of Islamic rule. In that same year, the monarchs decreed the expulsion of the Jews who did not accept conversion to Christianity. The Inquisition in this scenario was the instrument that would guarantee the authenticity of conversions, watching over converts suspected of secretly practicing their former faith. The objective was not only religious but also political, to create a homogeneous Catholic identity to sustain the new Spanish state. From the beginning, the structure of the Spanish Inquisition was distinct. In the year 1483, the monarchs created the Supreme Council of the Inquisition, also called the Suprema, which functioned as a central body coordinating all the tribunals spread across the peninsula. The Inquisitor General, appointed by the monarch and confirmed by the Pope, had extraordinary powers, subordinating even bishops and other ecclesiastical authorities. This degree of centralization was unprecedented and made the Spanish Inquisition a truly national institution, linked more to the throne than to Rome. The papacy had formal influence, but in practice, effective control was in the hands of the monarchy. The initial focus was on the converts, descendants of Jews who had converted to Christianity, but were accused of continuing to practice Jewish rituals in secret. These new Christians became the preferred target of the inquisitors, feeding an obsession that lasted for centuries. The tribunal investigated customs, festivities, diets, and even domestic habits, seeking signs of hidden Judaism. This surveillance not only reinforced orthodoxy, but also legitimized the policy of blood purity, which restricted the access of descendants of Jews to public offices and prestigious positions. Thus, the Inquisition not only repressed, but also institutionalized discriminations that shaped Spanish society for generations. Another targeted group were the Moriscos, Muslims converted to Christianity after the Reconquest. Although baptized, many maintained customs, language, and Islamic practices, which made them suspect. Throughout the 16th century, surveillance over them increased, culminating in mass expulsions between the years 1609 and 1614. The tribunal acted incisively against these communities, reinforcing the monarchy's policy of religious homogenization. Protestants, Enlightenment thinkers, alumbrados, and practitioners of witchcraft also entered the inquisitorial spotlight at different times, but the core of persecution always lay in minorities of Jewish and Islamic origin. The autos da fe, public spectacles in which sentences were read and penances applied, became symbols of the Spanish Inquisition. Held in squares and accompanied by crowds, they involved processions, sermons, the reading of guilt, and in the most serious cases, the handing over of the condemned to the secular arm. These events reinforced the pedagogy of orthodoxy and the authority of the monarchy. They were ceremonies of power, where faith and politics united before the collective gaze. The reach of the Spanish Inquisition was vast. Tribunals were established in various important cities, such as Toledo, Seville, Valladolid, Barcelona, and Valencia. With overseas expansion, it also reached the American colonies, monitoring religious practices in the New World. This imperial dimension gave the institution a global reach, connecting European religious repression to colonial societies. The political impact was profound. The Inquisition reinforced the central power of the monarchy, subordinating both local authorities and bishops and nobles. At the same time, it contributed to the creation of a national identity based on the Catholic faith, eliminating the religious diversity that had characterized the Iberian Peninsula for centuries. This homogenization came at a high cost: persecutions, expulsions, destruction of entire communities, and a culture of generalized mistrust. Despite its strength, the Spanish Inquisition also faced criticism and resistance. Jurists, intellectuals, and even some members of the Church questioned its methods and interference. In the 18th century, with the advance of Enlightenment ideas, pressure for reforms increased. The tribunal was temporarily abolished in the year 1808 during the Napoleonic invasion, restored in the year 1814, and definitively extinguished in the year 1834. Its long duration, however, left deep marks not only in Spain but throughout the Iberian world. The Spanish Inquisition thus symbolized the union between religion and politics in its most radical form. More than a spiritual court, it was an instrument of state-building and of imposing a homogeneous identity. Over more than 3 centuries, it shaped society, repressed dissent, and projected a shadow that still today arouses debates about intolerance, power, and historical memory. The conversos, known as New Christians, occupied a central role in the activity of the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions. They were descendants of Jews who, in different waves of persecution and pressure, had accepted baptism, often in a forced manner. However, the suspicion that these groups continued to practice Jewish rituals in secret, the so-called Judaizers, turned them into preferred targets of inquisitorial surveillance. This persecution was not only religious, but also social, cultural, and economic. marking in a profound way the Iberian and colonial history. The forced conversion of Jews was not a sudden phenomenon. Since the end of the 14th century, with massacres in various cities of the Iberian Peninsula, many Jews found themselves forced to choose between death, exile, or baptism. This process generated communities of converts who, formerly Christian, preserved Jewish practices in secret, such as keeping the Sabbath, avoiding pork, lighting candles at nightfall on Friday, or celebrating festivals discreetly inside the home. These crypto-Jewish practices were transmitted in the family environment, and even if in a fragmented way, kept alive a persecuted identity. For the Christian majority, however, these gestures were signs of betrayal. Judaizing heresy was seen as the most dangerous of all because it came from within. People who were baptized, integrated into social life, but supposedly deceiving the church and the crown. The Inquisition dedicated itself zealously to investigating conversos, gathering meticulous denunciations about dietary habits, words used at home, and even about forms of dress. This intense surveillance transformed the everyday life of new Christians into a terrain of constant suspicion in which any gesture could be interpreted as evidence of heresy. One of the most cruel instruments of exclusion was the creation of the statutes of blood purity. These norms, which arose in the 15th century and spread in the 16th century, established that descendants of converted Jews and Moors could not occupy important positions in the church, in the administration, or in universities. More than religious practice, genealogical origin began to matter. Even if a new Christian was devout and faithful to the church, his or her ancestry marked them as impure. This discrimination institutionalized prejudice, transforming it into a lasting social barrier. The obsession with purity of blood crossed generations and deeply affected social mobility in Spain and Portugal. Despite the restrictions, many new Christians reached positions of prominence in the economy. As merchants, bankers, physicians, and intellectuals, they played a fundamental role in the urban and mercantile development of the Iberian Peninsula. Some accumulated great fortunes, invested in businesses linked to Atlantic trade, and even came to occupy posts close to the court. This rise, however, increased hostility against them even more, feeding the idea that they grew rich illicitly or that they used their positions to secretly favor other Judaizers. The Inquisition, in this sense, also functioned as an instrument of economic control, confiscating the goods of accused families and redistributing wealth under the mantle of orthodoxy. The economic and social networks of new Christians extended beyond the peninsula. Many were connected to international commerce, linking Spain and Portugal to routes that included Northern Europe, the Mediterranean, and the New World. This global dimension reinforced the concern of the authorities, who feared that such connections might serve to strengthen Judaizing communities on a transnational scale. Inquisitorial surveillance, therefore, was not limited to the great cities of the peninsula, but followed the movements of families and merchants across the empire. The psychological and cultural impact of these persecutions was devastating. The constant fear of denunciation led families to hide religious practices, to alter names, and to erase traditions. Children were instructed to keep silent about family habits, while adults lived under the permanent tension of being observed. At the same time, many new Christians developed a hybrid religiosity, blending Jewish and Catholic practices in a syncretic way as a form of spiritual and cultural survival. This ambiguity, far from eliminating their identity, reinvented it amid persecution. The official discourse of the Inquisition justified the repression of new Christians as a defense of the purity of the faith. In practice, it was also a mechanism of social and political control. Surveillance over this group reinforced the authority of the monarchy, sustained the idea of Catholic unity, and offered financial resources through the confiscation of property. Over centuries, thousands of new Christians were prosecuted, condemned, and stigmatized, creating a legacy of exclusion that outlasted the end of the Inquisition itself. This legacy echoed in the American colonies, where descendants of new Christians were also the target of suspicion and proceedings. In Brazil, for example, several converted Jews and their descendants were persecuted during the inquisitorial visitations of the 16th century, accused of maintaining Jewish practices in secret. This demonstrates how inquisitorial surveillance went beyond the European space and transformed into an Atlantic phenomenon, accompanying the movements of populations and consolidating a global system of repression of religious diversity. In sum, conversos and new Christians were the privileged target of the Inquisition, not only for theological reasons, but because their presence put in check the ideal of social and religious unity that sustained the Iberian state. Their persecution reveals how the Inquisition was at once a court of faith, a political instrument, and a mechanism of social exclusion, shaping identities and hierarchies that persisted well beyond its formal extinction. The year 1492 is remembered in history as a multiple landmark. It was the year of the conquest of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in the Iberian Peninsula. The year Christopher Columbus departed westward and inaugurated Spanish transatlantic expansion. And equally decisive, the year in which the Catholic monarchs decreed the expulsion of the Jews who refused to accept baptism. This decision, formalized in the Edict of Alhambra, radically altered the social, cultural, and economic structure of Spain and inaugurated a new stage in the activity of the Inquisition. The rupture of 1492 was not only religious, but profoundly political, for it represented the consolidation of the monarchical project of unity through faith. The Edict of Expulsion was published in March of 1492 and determined that all Jews who did not convert to Christianity had to leave the territories of the Crown by the end of July of the same year. The document justified the measure by the negative influence that the Jews, according to the monarchs, exerted on the new Christians, encouraging them to secretly return to Jewish practices. The reasoning was clear. Eliminating the open Jewish presence would also eliminate the root of the Judaizing heresies that the Inquisition pursued so intensely. Thus, the expulsion was presented as a complement to inquisitorial vigilance, both tools of the same project of homogenization. The immediate consequences were dramatic. It is estimated that between 80,000 and 150,000 Jews left Spain in a short period of time. Many migrated to Portugal, where they found temporary refuge until in 1496, pressure for conversion also intensified there. Others went to North Africa, to the Ottoman Empire, which received them more tolerantly, and still others to regions of Italy, France, and the Low Countries. These diasporas gave rise to Sephardic communities spread throughout the Mediterranean and beyond, preserving the Ladino language and various Iberian traditions for centuries. The economic impact was profound. Jews occupied crucial functions in Spanish society, working as merchants, artisans, physicians, bankers, and administrators. Their departure meant the loss of an important part of qualified labor and international commercial networks. Many new Christians occupied these positions, but always under the shadow of suspicion and persecution. The monarchy, in turn, confiscated goods and properties of those who could not sell their belongings before leaving, which generated immediate gains for the royal treasury, but long-term losses for the vitality of the kingdom's economy. From a political point of view, the expulsion reinforced the power of the Catholic monarchs. By eliminating visible religious diversity and consolidating Catholicism as a unique identity, Ferdinand and Isabella presented their monarchy as a model of Christian unity before Europe. This discourse strengthened their legitimacy internally and externally, especially at a time when they sought to expand their diplomatic influence. The conquest of Granada, the expulsion of the Jews, and Columbus's voyage were interpreted as signs of a new era, marked by the triumph of the Catholic faith and the expansion of Spanish power. In this new scenario, the Inquisition played a central role. With the Jews officially expelled, the tribunal's focus turned even more toward the new Christians, watching for any sign of hidden Jewish practice. The institution became the permanent guardian of the homogenization policy, sustaining in practice the project initiated by the Catholic monarchs. Each denunciation of secret Judaism, each confiscation of property, each auto da fe reinforced the idea that Spain was now a nation purified by a single faith. The symbolic character of the expulsion also cannot be ignored. By banishing a community that had lived for centuries in the Iberian Peninsula, contributing to its culture and economy, the monarchy not only reorganized its society, but also rewrote its collective memory. Jewish presence began to be remembered as a foreign element, associated with danger and betrayal. The Inquisition, in turn, consolidated this discourse, transforming Judaism into a permanent symbol of heresy to be eradicated. This rupture of 1492 durably shaped Spanish identity. The obsession with blood purity, suspicion against conversos, inquisitorial vigilance, and the exclusion of religious minorities became pillars of a rigidly controlled society. At the same time, it gave rise to a Sephardic diaspora that spread throughout the world not only the trauma of expulsion, but also a cultural heritage that survived for centuries outside the peninsula. Thus, 1492 was not only the end of the legal Jewish presence in Spain, but the beginning of a new political and religious order in which the Inquisition played an indispensable role as guardian of orthodoxy. The Edict of Expulsion, the fall of Granada, and the beginning of Atlantic expansion intertwined in a single historical project, the construction of a centralized Catholic state intolerant of diversity. The human and cultural price of this choice would be felt not only in that time but across generations. After the expulsion of the Jews in 1492, the attention of the Spanish monarchy turned even more intensely to the Muslims who remained on the Iberian Peninsula. Many of them had accepted baptism as a condition for continuing to live in their newly conquered territories, especially after the fall of Granada. These converts, known as Moriscos, became constant targets of surveillance and distrust. The Crown and the Inquisition saw in them the same risk as in the new Christians, the suspicion of secret practices of the former faith. Between the years 1502 and 1614, the fate of the Moriscos was marked by impositions of forced Christianization, revolts, mass deportations, and the systematic smothering of their culture. The first step occurred in 1502, when the Catholic monarchs decreed that all Muslims in the Kingdom of Castile had to choose between baptism or exile. This measure expanded the policy already applied to the Jews and inaugurated a new phase of religious coercion. In Aragon and Valencia, pressure took a little longer to consolidate, but progressively the same logic imposed itself. Thus, from the beginning of the 16th century, the legal presence of unbaptized Muslims ceased to exist on the peninsula. Formerly Christians, the Moriscos were forcibly inserted into the social body, but were always viewed with suspicion. The Inquisition played a crucial role in this surveillance. Morisco customs were interpreted as signs of infidelity. The maintenance of the Arabic language, the use of traditional clothing, the preparation of specific foods, and even hygiene habits such as frequent bathing were denounced as indications of concealed Islamic practice. The tribunal recorded depositions about prayers said in secret, fasts during Ramadan, and hidden celebrations. Every cultural gesture became potential evidence of heresy. This constant suspicion created a climate of oppression in daily life, in which Morisco identity was forced to fade. The policies of assimilation were brutal. Laws forbade the use of the Arabic language, forced the adoption of Christian names, and imposed mixed marriages as a way to dilute the Muslim heritage. In some regions, Morisco agricultural practices, considered more efficient, continued to be exploited by landlords, but always under the stigma of a condemned cultural origin. Morisco music, dance, and poetry were also persecuted, stifling cultural expressions that had enriched the peninsula during centuries of coexistence among Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Resistance, however, did not disappear. Between 1568 and 1571, the region of the Alpujarras in the mountains of Granada was the scene of a great Morisco revolt against cultural and religious repression. The uprising mobilized thousands of insurgents who faced royal troops in intense battles. Repression was extremely harsh. Villages were burned, families deported, and leaders executed. The defeat marked the beginning of an even stricter policy of dispersal and assimilation. Many Moriscos were forcibly transferred to distant regions in a deliberate effort to break community ties and dissolve their collective identity. Despite repression, the Moriscos continued to play an important economic role. They were recognized as skilled farmers, responsible for irrigation and cultivation techniques that sustained part of agricultural production. This economic usefulness was one of the reasons they were not expelled immediately after their forced conversion. However, the growth of internal tensions and the fear that they maintained ties with Muslim powers in North Africa fueled the argument that they represented a permanent threat to the security of the kingdom. At the beginning of the 17th century, pressure against the Moriscos reached its limit. In 1609, King Philip III decreed their definitive expulsion, a measure that extended until 1614. It is estimated that between 275,000 and 300,000 Moriscos were forced to leave Spain, many of them settling in North Africa. This diaspora, similar to that of the Jews in 1492, marked the end of centuries of legal Muslim presence on the Iberian Peninsula. The economic consequences were significant, as entire regions lost qualified agricultural labor. From a cultural point of view, the expulsion represented an irreversible rupture with a tradition that had been a constitutive part of Iberian identity. The memory of the Moriscos remained laden with stigma. Those who remained hidden, converted more deeply, or integrated into other communities continued to carry the weight of suspicion. The Inquisition kept them under surveillance, reinforcing the discourse that they had never truly been Christians. This stigma perpetuated the logic of blood purity, which excluded descendants of converted Jews and Muslims from full social recognition. Between 1502 and 1614, therefore, the history of the Moriscos illustrates how the Inquisition was not only a religious court, but a mechanism of social engineering. Its activity, articulated with the policy of the monarchy, sought not only to watch over faith but to reshape identities and erase cultures. The final expulsion symbolized the triumph of homogenization, but also represented the irreparable loss of one of the traditions that had enriched the Iberian Peninsula for centuries. The 16th century represented a decisive turning point in the history of European Christianity, and the Inquisition played a crucial role in this scenario of religious tensions. The Reformation, initiated by Martin Luther in 1517, broke the unity of Western Christendom, giving rise to multiple Protestant movements, each with its own doctrine and practice. Spain and Portugal, deeply bound to the Church of Rome, reacted with rigor to any sign of penetration of these new ideas into their territories. In addition, within the Catholic universe itself, mystical and spiritual movements emerged, such as the Alumbrados, who were also persecuted. The defense of Tridentine orthodoxy, consolidated at the Council of Trent between 1545 and 1563, became the guiding principle of inquisitorial action, which not only combated external heretics, but also watched over the internal boundaries of Catholic spirituality. One of the first movements to attract the attention of the Inquisition on the peninsula was that of the Alumbrados. Emerging in Castile at the beginning of the 16th century, the Alumbrados were groups of mystics who defended a direct and interior experience of God, often dispensing with the mediation of the sacraments and the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Their practices included states of ecstasy, spiritual revelations, and the belief that the soul, illuminated by the Holy Spirit, achieved a perfection that made certain religious obligations unnecessary. For the Inquisition, these ideas were dangerous because they relativized the authority of the Church and could lead to contempt for ecclesiastical norms. Several leaders of the Alumbrados were prosecuted and condemned, and the movement was progressively suppressed, even though its ideas reappeared at different times over the centuries. The arrival of Protestant ideas in the peninsula represented an even greater challenge. Despite rigorous border control, Lutheran and Calvinist books circulated clandestinely, often brought by students traveling to European universities or by merchants involved in international trade. The reading of the Bible in the vernacular, the criticism of papal authority, and the emphasis on justification by faith were seen as direct threats to Catholicism. In the middle of the 16th century, centers of Protestantism were identified in cities such as Seville and Valladolid, involving both lay people and clergy. The reaction of the Inquisition was immediate: arrests, interrogations, and autos da fe that resulted in spectacular executions intended to demonstrate that Iberian soil would remain immune to the Reformation. The Lutherans were not the only targets. Calvinism, with its emphasis on predestination and rigorous ethics, also caused concern. Anabaptists, who preached baptism only for conscious adults and rejected the hierarchical structure of the Church, were considered particularly dangerous, as their communities represented a practical alternative to the established order. Although these groups never reached large dimensions in Spain or Portugal, their mere presence was enough to justify inquisitorial action, which sought to eradicate any possibility of a fissure in orthodoxy. In this context, the Council of Trent was fundamental. Meeting over nearly 2 decades, it clearly defined the dogmas and practices that should guide the Catholic Church. The reaffirmation of the importance of the sacraments, the authority of the Pope, The centrality of the Mass and the condemnation of Protestant doctrines became the basis of Tridentine orthodoxy. The Inquisition then assumed the role of guardian of this orthodoxy, persecuting any doctrine or practice that diverged from it. The tribunal became an indispensable instrument of the so-called Counter-Reformation, articulating theology, discipline, and politics. The fight against religious dissent was not limited to the peninsula. With overseas expansion, the Inquisition extended its vigilance to colonial territories, worrying about the circulation of forbidden books, the preaching of heretical ideas, and the presence of foreigners who could spread reformed doctrines. This Atlantic dimension of the tribunal reinforced its global character, connecting the defense of the faith to the needs of the empire. Tridentine orthodoxy, thus, was not only a European project, but a principle exported to the colonies as an integral part of cultural and religious domination. The impact on intellectual life was profound. Libraries were purged, books were burned, and writers began to censor themselves for fear of surveillance. The index of prohibited books, constantly updated, reflected this concern with controlling thought. Works of suspected authors were withdrawn from circulation, and even scientific and philosophical texts faced restrictions when they appeared to collide with official doctrine. The Inquisition, in this sense, not only repressed heresy but also shaped the limits of cultural and intellectual production. In summary, the 16th century was the period in which the Inquisition consolidated its function as guardian of Tridentine orthodoxy. By repressing Alumbrados, Lutherans, Calvinists, and Anabaptists, it reaffirmed the monopoly of the Catholic faith and helped to build an Iberian identity strongly linked to the Counter-Reformation. This vigilance, exercised both in the spiritual and intellectual spheres, contributed to the political stability of the monarchies, but also to the suffocation of religious and cultural alternatives. The price of this unity was systematic intolerance, which left deep marks on the history of the peninsula and its colonial domains. The relationship of the Inquisition with witchcraft in Spain reveals a peculiar and even paradoxical trajectory when compared to the rest of Europe. While in various regions, such as the German territories, France and Scotland, the witch hunts resulted in thousands of executions, in Spain, the inquisitorial proceedings, though rigorous, were relatively more contained. This does not mean the absence of persecutions, but rather an approach that, after critical episodes at the beginning of the 17th century, came to adopt a methodical skepticism, above all thanks to the actions of an inquisitor who stood out for his rationality, Alonso de Salazar Frias. His intervention between the years 1610 and 1614, especially in the famous witchcraft trials in Navarre, changed the course of inquisitorial policy and drastically reduced death sentences for sorcery. The most emblematic case occurred in Logroño in 1610, when the Inquisition conducted a major trial against alleged witches from the valley of Zugarramurdi in the Basque region. Hundreds of people were accused of taking part in demonic sabbaths, making pacts with the devil, bewitching neighbors and performing nocturnal rituals. The climate of popular hysteria, fueled by local rivalries, rumors, and confessions extracted under torture, led the court to hand down severe sentences. In a famous auto da fe, 11 people were burned at the stake, and dozens received penalties of public penance. This episode could have opened the way to a wave of mass executions like those that devastated Central Europe. However, from that proceeding onward, Alonso de Salazar Frias was charged with investigating the accusations more deeply. Unlike many of his colleagues, he adopted a skeptical and analytical stance. During his visits to the villages, he collected testimonies, examined supposed evidence, and found that most confessions were due to psychological pressure, torture, or the desire to escape harsher penalties. He also observed that many of the stories about Sabbaths and demonic pacts had no real basis, but were the product of rumors, collective fears, and popular imagination. His conclusion, recorded in official reports, was forceful. There were no warlocks nor witches until people began to talk and write about them. This sentence sums up his view that the persecution fed the very belief in witchcraft. Salazar Frias's recommendations profoundly influenced the guidelines of the Suprema, the Central Council of the Spanish Inquisition. From then on, it was established that confessions obtained solely under torture should not be considered valid, that the mere repetition of rumors did not constitute proof, and that the court should demand concrete evidence of the practice of sorcery before condemning someone. This institutional skepticism did not mean the end of witchcraft trials, but it greatly limited their severity. The Inquisition began to impose more spiritual and corrective penalties, such as public penances and the use of the sanbenito, than death sentences. Another crucial point was the distinction between popular superstition and demonic pact. The Suprema instructed inquisitors to treat with greater indulgence practices of folk healing, prayers and blessings, interpreting them as ignorance and superstition, not as formal heresy. This differentiation helped reduce the number of executions and contain the collective panic that, in other regions, led to the persecution of thousands of people. Spain, although not free from persecutions and autos da fe, became one of the places where the witch hunt was relatively limited, largely thanks to Salazar Frias's stance. This episode illustrates how the Inquisition, although a repressive institution, could also act as a brake on uncontrolled popular violence. In various regions of Europe, witchcraft trials were conducted by secular courts, often without clear criteria, resulting in mass executions. In Spain, by contrast, the weight of inquisitorial bureaucracy, together with the skepticism that took hold after 1614, significantly reduced the number of deaths. Records show that, while in the German territories executions for witchcraft reached the tens of thousands, in Spain the total number remained in the low hundreds over the whole of its history. Even so, the fear of witchcraft remained alive in the collective imagination. The mere fact that the Inquisition opened proceedings, interrogated suspects, and imposed public penances reinforced the idea that the demonic pact was a real threat. The stigma fell mainly on women, often healers, midwives, or those socially marginalized. The association between sorcery and female vulnerability was common, even though repression in Spain did not reach the brutality seen in other European regions. Therefore, the actions of Alonso de Salazar Frias marked a watershed in the history of the witch hunt. His rational investigation and skepticism led the Suprema to adopt guidelines that, contrary to the climate of hysteria predominant in Europe, reduced convictions and halted mass executions. This episode shows how, even within an institution marked by intolerance and violence, there were moments of restraint and rationalization. By turning the fight against witchcraft into a more controlled and less lethal process, the Spanish Inquisition left a distinct mark on the European history of repression of magical practices. The Portuguese Inquisition was formally instituted in 1536, after negotiations between King John III and Pope Paul III. Although it depended on papal authorization, the tribunal was from the outset under strong control of the monarchy, reflecting the Iberian tendency to transform the Inquisition into an instrument of political power and state centralization. Unlike the medieval version, which answered directly to the papacy, the Portuguese Inquisition was, in fact, a national institution, deeply intertwined with the interests of the crown. For nearly 3 centuries, it consolidated itself as one of the most enduring expressions of the Holy Office, shaping the society, economy, and culture of Portugal and its overseas dominions. The structure of the tribunal was designed to cover the entire territory of the kingdom. The center of power was in Lisbon, seat of the General Council of the Holy Office, from which the main decisions emanated. In addition to Lisbon, regional tribunals were created in Coimbra and Évora, which judged local cases and were subordinated to the coordination of the central body. This network allowed for constant vigilance over the different regions of the country, ensuring that the repression of heresies and religious deviations was comprehensive and systematic. The Inquisitor General, the highest authority of the institution, was appointed by the king and confirmed by the Pope, but in practice responded primarily to the interests of the monarchy. This characteristic ensured that the Portuguese Holy Office functioned as an instrument of the crown, serving not only to preserve Catholic orthodoxy, but also to reinforce the king's political authority. The tribunal was therefore deeply embedded in the structure of power, and its actions reflected both religious concerns and strategies of social and economic control. The main target of the Portuguese Inquisition were the New Christians, descendants of Jews who had converted and were accused of secretly practicing Jewish rites. This persecution profoundly marked Portuguese society. creating an atmosphere of permanent suspicion and social exclusion. The concept of purity of blood became a fundamental criterion for access to positions, honors, and prestige, establishing a rigid barrier to the advancement of families of Jewish origin. The Inquisition was in charge of investigating, prosecuting, and punishing any sign of hidden Judaism, often based on weak or personally motivated denunciations. The tribunals of Lisbon, Coimbra, and Evora were composed of a complex bureaucracy: inquisitors, prosecutors, theological qualifiers, notaries, jailers, and familiars of the Holy Office. This network of officials sustained the daily functioning of the institution, collecting denunciations, conducting interrogations, recording proceedings, and ensuring the execution of sentences. The presence of familiars, laymen appointed to collaborate with the tribunal, further expanded the reach of the Holy Office, transforming it into a true network of social surveillance that penetrated everyday community life. The jurisdiction of the Portuguese Inquisition was not limited to European territory. With the expanding overseas empire, the tribunal extended its authority to the colonies, sending visitors and receiving denunciations from Brazil, Africa, and Asia. The inquisitorial visitations were fundamental in carrying the repressive logic of the Holy Office overseas, monitoring new Christians who had settled in the colonies and persecuting religious practices considered deviant, such as witchcraft, indigenous shamanism, and syncretisms. In this way, the Portuguese Inquisition became a transatlantic phenomenon, following the dynamics of the empire itself. Beyond religious persecution, the Portuguese Inquisition had a strong economic impact. The confiscation of the condemned's property was a recurring practice, serving to finance the tribunal and, in many cases, to enrich members of the institution and even the crown. This economic dimension reinforced the political function of the Holy Office, as it weakened new Christian families who had accumulated wealth and influence. The fear of patrimonial loss made the Inquisition even more feared, since condemnation affected not only freedom and honor, but also the means of subsistence. The relationship between the Holy Office and the Portuguese monarchy was one of interdependence. The king used the Inquisition to consolidate his power, ensuring the religious homogeneity of the kingdom and controlling groups considered dangerous. In return, the tribunal reinforced its authority by presenting itself as the spiritual arm of royal power, legitimizing political decisions and creating an image of defense of the faith. This symbiosis explains the longevity of the institution, which endured for centuries, even amidst growing criticism. In the 18th century, with the advance of Enlightenment ideas and increasing pressure for reforms, the Portuguese Inquisition began to be questioned. The Marquis of Pombal, Prime Minister under King Joseph V, significantly reduced its power after the Tavora affair in 1759 and expelled the Jesuits in 1767, showing that the repressive logic no longer fully met the needs of the modern state. Despite these changes, the institution survived until 1821, when it was officially abolished during the political transformations that marked the beginning of constitutionalism in Portugal. The Portuguese Inquisition, therefore, between 1536 and 1821, was much more than a religious tribunal. It constituted an instrument of political, social, and economic control, deeply intertwined with the monarchy. Its network of tribunals, its overseas jurisdiction, and its constant vigilance shaped the lives of thousands of people, leaving deep marks on the history of the kingdom and its colonies. At the same time, its trajectory reveals the capacity of religion to become a tool of state power, used to reinforce hierarchies, exclude minorities, and perpetuate the idea of unity through faith. The Portuguese Inquisition, besides being a religious and political tribunal, was also an economic mechanism of great importance. Its operation was directly linked to the confiscation of the goods of the condemned, a practice that not only financially sustained the institution, but also deeply affected entire families and communities. This economic aspect helps to understand how the Holy Office inserted itself into the material life of the kingdom and the empire, shaping credit networks, altering the circulation of wealth, and creating social imbalances that went far beyond the realm of faith. Confiscation was automatic in cases of serious conviction, especially in proceedings against new Christians accused of hidden Judaism. When arrested, the defendant already had his assets sequestered by the tribunal, even before the final sentence. This sequestration included houses, lands, jewelry, books, clothes, and even household utensils. The estate was inventoried and came to be administered by the Holy Office, which often used part of these resources to pay for the defendant's own imprisonment, generating a cruel irony. The accused financed, with his assets, the very process that tried him. When the conviction was confirmed, the goods were publicly auctioned, and the money went to the coffers of the tribunal and, indirectly, to the crown. The auctions of confiscated goods were notable events. Held in public squares, they attracted buyers from different social strata, interested in acquiring properties and objects at reduced prices. This created a parallel market of opportunities that benefited specific sectors of society, often linked to the very circle of familiars of the Holy Office or to groups close to royal power. For the condemned and their families, however, the auctions meant ruin. Besides losing their assets, they were publicly exposed as heretics, bearing the stigma of infamy. This mechanism had devastating effects on new Christian communities. Many of them had achieved prosperity in commerce, medicine, administration, and finance. Systematic confiscation, coupled with the stigma of permanent suspicion, corroded this economic base and hindered social ascent. Entire families were ruined, and even descendants who had not been condemned bore the mark of infamy, facing obstacles to holding public office or entering religious orders. Thus, the Inquisition functioned as an instrument of social blockage, controlling and limiting the mobility of groups considered undesirable. The economic logic of the Holy Office also manifested itself in credit. Often, confiscated goods were used as a form of debt payment or served as collateral for loans. In addition, the inquisitorial proceedings themselves generated debts for the accused. Costs of imprisonment, food, and procedures were charged to the defendants, further increasing their financial ruin. Some historians point out that in certain contexts, the Inquisition operated almost like a coercive credit institution, in which faith was the pretext for expropriations that benefited the state and its allies. In the Atlantic context, the impact was equally significant. Many new Christians were linked to overseas trade, especially with Brazil, Africa, and Asia. Their mercantile networks were vital to the flow of sugar, enslaved people, spices, and precious metals. By persecuting these groups and confiscating their assets, the Inquisition interfered directly in the Atlantic circulation of capital. Merchants who had their fortunes confiscated left gaps in the commercial chains, causing instability and even benefiting foreign competitors. At the same time, part of these confiscated resources was redirected to finance enterprises of the crown, such as wars, constructions, and the imperial administration itself. Confiscation and the redistribution of goods therefore created a parallel economy of fear. Being denounced to the Inquisition meant not only spiritual or physical risk, but also patrimonial ruin. This mechanism even encouraged denunciations motivated by economic rivalries, since the fall of a competitor could mean an opportunity for another to rise. The border between religious zeal and economic interest was thin, and the Holy Office became a fundamental piece in the mechanism that linked faith, power, and wealth. In the long term, this policy had ambiguous effects. On the one hand, it provided significant resources for the functioning of the Inquisition and for the Portuguese state, consolidating the tribunal as a long-lasting institution. On the other hand, it weakened dynamic sectors of the economy, such as new Christian merchants, who could have contributed more broadly to the development of the empire. The result was a paradox. In the name of faith, the Holy Office fueled practices that ultimately harmed the economic vitality of the kingdom. In summary, the Portuguese Inquisition cannot be understood solely as a tribunal of faith. It was also a central economic actor, whose logic of confiscation, auction, and redistribution of goods shaped the material life of thousands of people. By ruining entire communities and intervening in the commercial networks of the Atlantic, the Holy Office left a deep mark on the economic history of Portugal and its colonies, demonstrating how religious intolerance also translated into mechanisms of expropriation and social control. The presence of the Inquisition in Brazil never occurred through the installation of a permanent tribunal, as in Lisbon, Coimbra, or Évora. Even so, the colonial territory was not free from inquisitorial vigilance. Between 1591 and 1618, the so-called visitations took place, expeditions sent by the Holy Office to investigate suspicious religious practices, collect denunciations, and initiate proceedings against colonists accused of heresy, Judaism, witchcraft, bigamy, and other transgressions. These moments reveal how the inquisitorial logic crossed the Atlantic and became rooted in the colony's daily life, leaving lasting marks. The first visitation occurred in 1591, led by the visitor Heitor Furtado de Mendonça, officially sent to Bahia. Settled in Salvador, then the colonial capital, he summoned the population to appear and give testimony or confess possible faults against the faith. For months, hundreds of people underwent interrogations in an atmosphere of intense moral pressure. The strategy followed the European model. Edicts of faith were read publicly, establishing the duty to denounce neighbors and relatives. The climate of suspicion spread quickly, transforming daily life into a space of surveillance and fear. The main targets of these investigations were the New Christians, numerous in Brazil due to the migration of Portuguese families seeking new economic opportunities. Many of them worked in trade, crafts, and sugar cultivation, forming an important part of the colonial elite. The denunciations often revolved around Judaizing practices carried out in secret, such as avoiding pork, lighting candles on Friday evenings, or reciting prayers different from Catholic ones. These accusations were often motivated by commercial rivalries or personal conflicts, but were recorded as evidence of heresy. The result was the opening of numerous proceedings that were later sent to Lisbon for judgment. The visitation was not limited to Bahia. Between 1593 and 1595, the same Heitor Furtado de Mendonça conducted investigations in Pernambuco, where the sugar economy was thriving. There, the number of new Christians was equally significant, and denunciations of hidden Judaism multiplied. Records show how the tribunal collected minutiae of daily life. Eating habits, ways of celebrating holidays, private conversations, and even seemingly banal gestures were transformed into proofs of heresy. The network of denunciations expanded, and the fear of being reported shaped social relations. A second phase of visitations took place between 1618 and 1620, again in Bahia and Pernambuco, reinforcing the vigilance over the colonists. On that occasion, besides accusations against New Christians, there were also denunciations related to practices of witchcraft, healing rituals, and religious syncretism. Contact with indigenous and African populations introduced new forms of religiosity that, from the European perspective, were interpreted as superstition or demonic pact. Midwives, healers, and African or indigenous spiritual leaders became targets of suspicion, revealing how the Inquisition tried to control not only Judaism, but all forms of religiosity that escaped official Catholicism. The operation of the visitations followed a fixed ritual. The visitor settled in a strategic location, published the edicts of faith, and received confessions and denunciations. Many people appeared spontaneously, driven by fear of being accused or by the hope of receiving light sentences through voluntary confession. Others were summoned to testify because of suspicion raised by neighbors or rivals. The testimonies were carefully recorded and sent to Lisbon, where the Holy Office tribunals evaluated and judged the cases. This system created a direct link between the colony and the metropolis, inserting Brazil into the global machinery of the Inquisition. The impacts of the visitations were profound. In addition to generating convictions, imprisonments, and confiscation of property, they consolidated a culture of mistrust. Social life became permeated by the fear of denunciations, which reinforced divisions among groups and made coexistence more difficult. For New Christians in particular, vigilance meant living permanently under threat, with fragile reputations and property always at risk. The visitations, therefore, fulfilled a role of collective disciplining, exporting to the colony the logic of control that characterized the Holy Office in Portugal. It is important to emphasize that the absence of a permanent tribunal in Brazil did not mean the absence of the Inquisition. On the contrary, the visitations showed that the colony was part of a surveillance space that extended throughout the Portuguese Empire. Even far from Lisbon, colonists knew that their actions could be judged by the Holy Office, and this awareness shaped behaviors and beliefs. The memory of the visitations, recorded in documents and accounts, survived as testimony of the inquisitorial presence in colonial Brazil. In summary, Between 1591 and 1618, the visitations of the Holy Office transformed Brazil into a stage of inquisitorial repression. Led by visitors such as Heitor Furtado de Mendonça, they collected denunciations, investigated communities, and left marks of fear and exclusion. By exporting to the colony the European model of faith surveillance, the Inquisition reinforced religious homogenization and extended the reach of its authority, proving that its logic was not limited to the peninsula, but accompanied the Atlantic imperial movement. The persecution of new Christians was not limited to European territory. In colonial Brazil, many descendants of converted Jews found space to work in commerce, agricultural production, and the urban networks that structured the colony's economy. Nevertheless, even thousands of kilometers from Lisbon, the shadow of the Inquisition reached them. The so-called Luso-Brazilian Judaizers were constantly accused of secretly practicing Jewish rituals, and their economic and social rise aroused further suspicion. The inquisitorial repression against them illustrates the transatlantic reach of the Holy Office and shows how intolerance intertwined with social and commercial disputes. New Christians played an essential role in the colony's mercantile networks. Established in cities such as Salvador, Olinda, Recife, and Rio de Janeiro, they worked in the trade of sugar, enslaved people, textiles, and spices. Many were also skilled artisans, physicians, and professionals, contributing to the expanding urban life. These activities made them indispensable figures in the colonial economy, but at the same time fueled resentment among competitors and neighbors. Any sign of prosperity was interpreted as suspect, and financial success often became an argument to accuse them of hidden Judaism. The private religious practices of these groups were discreet but revealing. Entire families maintained customs handed down from generation to generation, even if in fragmented form and adapted to the Christian context. Avoiding pork, lighting candles on Friday evenings, reciting prayers in a low voice, or observing days of fasting were signs that, in the eyes of the Inquisition, sufficed to raise accusations. Because religion was lived in the domestic sphere, a denunciation from a neighbor, a household slave, or even an estranged relative was enough to open a case. The intimate space that should have been a refuge became a permanent risk. Urban sociability reinforced this climate of suspicion. In colonial towns where everyone knew each other, rumors spread quickly. A family's reserved behavior, their absence from certain religious ceremonies, or the way they celebrated festivals could be interpreted as evidence of Judaism. Thus, new Christians lived in a constant state of surveillance, forced to balance their cultural identity with the pressures of assimilation. Many regularly attended Mass and participated in Catholic confraternities while preserving practices inherited from their ancestors. This duplicity was, paradoxically, a strategy for survival. Inquisitorial repression in Brazil materialized especially during the visitations between 1591 and 1618. In that period, dozens of new Christians were denounced and prosecuted. Many had their names sent to Lisbon, where they were tried and convicted. Some were imprisoned and shipped to the metropolis on long journeys that symbolized the global scope of the Holy Office. The threat was real. At any moment, a merchant or artisan could be torn from his routine and turned into a defendant in a trial that endangered not only his life, but also his family's future. One of the most emblematic cases of repression against new Christians of Luso-Brazilian origin was that of Antonio José da Silva, known as the Jew. Born in Rio de Janeiro in 1705 into a new Christian family, he was sent to Portugal as a youth, where he stood out as a playwright. His theatrical career was brilliant, with highly successful plays in Lisbon marked by humor, social critique, and irony. Even so, his family background and Jewish origins never ceased to haunt him. In 1726, he was arrested by the Inquisition on charges of Judaism, but managed to secure release after some time in prison. Later, in 1737, he was again accused, this time more seriously. The court found him guilty of Judaizing practices and condemned him to death. In 1739, Antonio José da Silva was strangled and burned at an auto da fe in Lisbon, becoming a tragic symbol of inquisitorial repression against new Christians. His trajectory illustrates the impossibility of fully escaping the mark of suspicion. Even culturally integrated and famous for his works in the heart of the Portuguese capital, his ancestry was enough to condemn him. The case of Antonio José da Silva was not isolated. He represents the visible face of a process that affected thousands of Luso-Brazilian families. In Brazil, many continued to play a central role in economic life, but always under the risk of denunciations. The inquisitorial presence, even if indirect, stifled their freedom and restricted their social mobility. The culture of fear shaped their choices, leading some to try to erase any trace of their origin, while others resisted in secret, preserving rituals passed down silently from generation to generation. In some, Luso-Brazilian Judaizers show that the Inquisition was not only a European phenomenon, but a transatlantic one. Its repression combined religious persecution, economic control, and social exclusion, striking communities that were fundamental to colonial development. By monitoring their mercantile networks, punishing their private practices, and destroying trajectories such as that of Antonio José da Silva, the Holy Office reaffirmed its global presence, extending intolerance overseas and leaving scars that remained alive long beyond its formal extinction. In colonial Brazil, the Inquisition did not find only suspicions of Judaism or heresies of European origin. Upon crossing the Atlantic, the tribunal encountered a plural cultural universe where indigenous beliefs, African traditions brought by the enslaved, and European popular practices intermingled in a mosaic of religiosities. From the European perspective, this whole ensemble was often interpreted as witchcraft, superstition, or demonic pact. The inquisitorial visitations and the records sent to Lisbon reveal how the Holy Office sought to discipline this complex field, even without a permanent tribunal installed in Brazil. One of the main targets were the calundas, religious practices of African origin that involved chants, dances, spiritual trance, and healing rituals. Many colonists turned to these ceremonies in search of health, luck, or protection, which made African spiritual leaders important figures in local life. For the inquisitors, however, the calundas were seen as witchcraft, associated with the invocation of spirits and idolatry. Several trials recorded descriptions of rituals in which participants sang, beat drums, and fell into trance, elements that were interpreted as proof of demonic influence. Repression, however, did not eliminate these practices, which survived through Brazilian religious syncretism. Indigenous pajelanças were also targeted by the Inquisition. Pajés, healers, and spiritual leaders of native communities played central roles, mediating relations with the spiritual world and using medicinal plants in healing rituals. These elements were fundamental to indigenous cosmology, but in the eyes of inquisitorial visitors, they were read as superstition and idolatry. The use of chants, smoke, herbs, and collective dances was described in records as witchcraft, reinforcing the Eurocentric view that reduced complex spiritualities to religious crimes. The Inquisition thus not only repressed, but also contributed to delegitimizing traditional knowledge. Blessings and popular prayers of European origin were also targeted. Midwives, healers, and prayer women used oral formulas, signs of the cross, and prayers mixed with magical elements to cure illnesses or ward off harm. Although many of these practices were accepted in daily life as expressions of popular religiosity, the boundary between devotion and witchcraft was tenuous. When denounced, these women were accused of invoking demonic forces or of using sacraments improperly. Thus, practices that blended Catholic devotion with magical elements were reinterpreted as heresy, showing how the Inquisition also controlled European popular religiosity transplanted to Brazil. Syncretism was another point of tension. In various regions, African and indigenous practices merged with Catholic devotions, resulting in hybrid forms of worship. The invocation of saints associated with African deities, the use of Christian images in healing rituals, and the adaptation of popular festivals created a religious field that escaped orthodoxy's control. The Inquisition saw this syncretism as a sign of heresy and sought to repress it, although it never managed to eliminate it. On the contrary, repression ended up forcing many of these practices into hiding, consolidating clandestine traditions transmitted orally. The denunciations recorded during visitations reveal the extent of this repression. Enslaved Africans, indigenous people, and poor women were often accused of witchcraft, but there were also white colonists among the denounced, generally for seeking healers or participating in rituals. This shows that cultural boundaries were permeable. The appeal of healing and magical practices crossed classes and ethnicities. For the Inquisition, however, this circulation was dangerous as it undermined the Church's spiritual monopoly. The tribunal thus sought to reaffirm Catholic orthodoxy as the only legitimate form of religiosity, combating any parallel manifestation. The impact of inquisitorial repression was profound. Many healers and spiritual leaders were arrested, sent to Lisbon, and tried as heretics. Others received lighter sentences, such as public penances, but carried the stigma of witchcraft for the rest of their lives. At the same time, persecution reinforced the social marginalization of women, Africans, and indigenous peoples who already occupied vulnerable positions. The label of sorcerer or witch often served as a form of control and exclusion, perpetuating colonial hierarchies. Nevertheless, repression did not manage to erase these traditions. On the contrary, many survived through secrecy and syncretism. The Calundas gave rise to Afro-Brazilian religious forms that endured through time. Pajelanças preserved their vitality within indigenous communities, and popular blessings remain alive today in many regions. This survival demonstrates that, despite the power of the Inquisition, religious diversity in colonial Brazil could never be fully subdued. Thus, inquisitorial action against witchcraft and healing practices in Brazil shows the reach of religious intolerance, but also reveals the resilience of Afro-Brazilian and indigenous traditions. Repression, far from eliminating them, ended up shaping their forms of survival, forcing them into concealment and syncretism. This dynamic, which spanned centuries, helped compose Brazil's plural religious identity, marked by tension between Catholic orthodoxy and popular practices that were persecuted but never extinguished. The presence of the Society of Jesus in colonial Brazil and in other parts of the Portuguese Empire represented one of the greatest missionary forces in Christian history. Founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola, the Jesuit order assumed as its central mission the evangelization of peoples considered Gentiles, that is, those who had not received Christian baptism. In the colonial territory, the Jesuits became chiefly responsible for the catechism of indigenous populations and for the education of the colonial elite. This activity inevitably placed them in both dialogue and tension with the Inquisition, since both were arms of the project to consolidate Catholic orthodoxy, but with methods and goals that did not always coincide. From the standpoint of cooperation, Jesuits and inquisitors shared the same goal: to preserve the Catholic faith and eliminate any form of heresy or idolatry. The missionaries saw themselves as soldiers of Christ, combating indigenous beliefs they considered demonic superstitions. For them, converting the original populations was not only a spiritual matter, but also an act of integration into the colonial order. In this sense, the Inquisition supported the Jesuit effort, supplying the doctrinal framework that defined which practices were acceptable and which should be repressed. The fight against witchcraft, folk healing, and religious syncretism drew nourishment both from Jesuit pedagogy and from inquisitorial vigilance. However, there were also significant tensions. While the Inquisition operated on the basis of repression and punishment, the Jesuits, in many cases, relied on persuasion and adaptation. In the mission villages, called reductions, priests learned indigenous languages, translated prayers, and sought to insert elements of local culture into their catechetical practices. This flexibility was seen by some inquisitors as a risk of relativism, as it could open space for forms of syncretism. At the same time, the Jesuits criticized the excessive harshness of the Holy Office, arguing that newly converted populations could not be measured by the same standards of orthodoxy applied in Europe. This methodological divergence generated subtle friction between the two powers. Another point of debate was the situation of enslaved Africans. Brought in large numbers to Brazil and other colonies, they carried diverse religious traditions rooted in the worship of deities, ancestors, and forces of nature. For the Jesuits, evangelizing this population was a fundamental task, but also extremely difficult due to cultural diversity and the violent conditions of captivity. In many cases, conversion was superficial, and African practices survived alongside Catholic devotion. The Inquisition saw in this a fertile ground for accusations of witchcraft and heresy. The Jesuits, however, insisted that the process of catechesis required time, patience, and a degree of initial tolerance, which again created differences of approach between missionaries and inquisitors. In the indigenous missions, these tensions were even more visible. The Jesuits devoted themselves to creating settlements where the natives were gathered, instructed in the Christian faith, and inserted into a new communal way of life. This strategy sought not only conversion, but also protection against exploitation by colonists who wished to enslave indigenous people. The inquisitors, by contrast, were more focused on monitoring religious practices. Thus, while the Jesuits tried to preserve some space for cultural negotiation to secure adherence, the Holy Office saw any remnant of indigenous ritual as a threat. This difference did not prevent cooperation, but it revealed distinct ways of dealing with the challenge of mass conversion. Beyond indigenous and African populations, the Jesuits also worked with the colonial elites. They founded colleges, seminaries, and universities, training the generation that would occupy positions of political, religious, and administrative leadership. In this sphere, their action converged with that of the Inquisition. Educating the elites meant shaping mindsets within Tridentine orthodoxy, ensuring there was no room for Protestant or Enlightenment ideas. The control of thought was thus a shared task, albeit with different styles, the pedagogical on the Jesuit side and the repressive on that of the Holy Office. At times, however, the Jesuits came into direct conflict with inquisitorial logic. Their defense of indigenous populations, their political and economic influence, and their relative autonomy aroused suspicion from both the monarchy and the Holy Office. The best-known example was the expulsion of the Society of Jesus from Portugal and its colonies in 1759 under the leadership of the Marquis of Pombal. Although this decision had more political and economic than religious motivations, it also reflected the accumulated tensions between Jesuit flexibility and inquisitorial rigor. In sum, the relationship between Jesuits and the Inquisition in the colonial world was marked by cooperation and tension. Both served the same project of religious homogenization and the strengthening of monarchical and Catholic power, but they diverged on methods and on the limits of cultural adaptation. This ambivalence shows that spiritual control was not a homogeneous bloc. Even within Catholic orthodoxy, there were debates and disputes about the best way to convert, monitor, and discipline the populations of the empire. Among the many episodes that mark the history of the Portuguese Inquisition, the trial against Father Antonio Vieira occupies a place of prominence. Born in Lisbon in 1608 and transferred as a child to Brazil, Vieira became one of the greatest orators of the Portuguese language, a Jesuit missionary, and a figure of enormous political influence in the empire. His involvement in debates about new Christians, messianic prophecies, and the conduct of the Portuguese imperial project made him a target of inquisitorial vigilance. Between the years 1660 and 1670, Vieira faced imprisonment, interrogations, and censorship, but he also knew how to use his intelligence and prestige to negotiate with Rome and defend his ideas. The root of the conflict lay in his position toward the new Christians. Vieira believed that the systematic persecution against them was harmful to the kingdom and the empire. He defended that the descendants of converted Jews should be fully integrated into Portuguese society without suffering blood discrimination. He argued that many of them were essential to the economy, especially in Atlantic trade and colonial administration. This direct defense clashed with the logic of the Holy Office, which saw the new Christians as enemies of the faith. Vieira wrote and preached in favor of abolishing the statutes of blood purity, which earned him accusations of favoring heretics. Another explosive element was his adherence to prophetic currents inspired by the Franciscan Joachim of Fiore and by Portuguese messianic traditions. Vieira believed that Portugal was destined to lead the world in the expansion of Christianity and that a fifth empire would arise under the Lusitanian banner. In sermons and writings, he suggested that the Portuguese Empire would be God's instrument to usher in a new era of universal peace. These ideas, which blended politics and prophecy, aroused suspicion among the inquisitors, who interpreted them as dangerous and potentially heretical deviations. The formal trial began in 1663, when Vieira was denounced for his sermons and writings. Imprisoned in Coimbra, he remained incarcerated for 2 years, being interrogated and forced to answer accusations of disguised Judaism, false prophecies, and defiance of the authority of the Holy Office. His political enemies, both within the church and at court, seized the moment to weaken his position. Despite his imprisonment, Vieira maintained a firm stance and presented a defense based on theological and juridical arguments, demonstrating profound knowledge of the scriptures and Christian tradition. In 1667, Vieira was finally sentenced to public penances and to obligatory silence on matters of prophecy. This sentence aimed to silence his voice on messianic themes and limit his influence. However, he did not resign himself to the decision and sought to appeal directly to Rome. His political skill manifested itself once again. He obtained support from Jesuit sectors and from figures linked to the papal court. In 1669, the Congregation of the Holy Office in Rome reviewed his case and lifted much of the restrictions, allowing him to gradually resume his intellectual and political activity. The episode of his trial thus reveals the complexity of the Inquisition. It was not merely a tribunal blind to reason, but an institution embedded in political and intellectual disputes. Vieira was not a common defendant. He was a figure of weight, whose ideas challenged orthodoxy, but also interested the Portuguese imperial project. His defense of the New Christians, for example, was linked to a pragmatic vision of strengthening the empire's economy, and his messianic prophecies expressed both religious fervor and political ambition. His imprisonment and trial did not destroy his career. After his release, Vieira remained active, albeit more cautiously. He wrote works of great impact, such as The History of the Future, in which he developed his prophetic conceptions and maintained his diplomatic activity in defense of Portuguese interests in Rome. His trajectory shows how it was possible, even within the repressive environment of the Inquisition, to negotiate, resist, and even impose limits on the tribunal, provided one had intellectual prestige and networks of political support. The case of Vieira remained in memory as an example of the tension between creative thought and inquisitorial repression. While it illustrates the institution's intolerance toward divergent ideas, it also shows the ability of certain exceptional figures to escape the tribunal's nets. His imprisonment between 1660 and 1670, his prophecies about the Fifth Empire, and his defense of the New Christians synthesize one of the most significant moments in the relationship between the Inquisition and intellectual life in the Portuguese Empire. The Roman Inquisition, also called the Congregation of the Holy Office, was established in 1542 by Pope Paul III at the height of the religious tensions provoked by the Protestant Reformation. Unlike the Iberian Inquisitions, which were under strong control of national monarchies, the Roman version was organized as a centralized tribunal at the heart of the Catholic Church, directly subordinate to the Pope and the Roman Curia. Its main objective was to defend Catholic orthodoxy in the face of the expansion of Protestantism and to supervise in a systematic way doctrine in all territories where papal authority was present. This centralized and universal character distinguished the Roman Holy Office from other inquisitorial experiences. The structure was conceived as a permanent congregation of the Curia, composed of cardinals who acted as judges and were appointed directly by the Pope. The office of prefect of the congregation was, in many cases, occupied by the pontiff himself, reinforcing the direct link between the tribunal and the highest authority of the Church. This characteristic ensured that fundamental decisions on heresy and orthodoxy did not depend on kings or local governments, but were made in Rome, guaranteeing doctrinal unity. The congregation met weekly to examine cases, approve sentences, and discuss new threats to the Catholic faith. The working body of the Holy Office included not only cardinals, but also commissioners, theological consultants, book censors, qualifiers, and notaries. The commissioners were responsible for conducting investigations, issuing arrest warrants, and carrying out interrogations. The theological consultants evaluated accusations and produced opinions on the gravity of suspect doctrines. The notaries ensured the meticulous drafting of each proceeding, preserving records that today constitute one of the richest sources for the history of the Church and of religious repression. This detailed organization gave the Holy Office a bureaucratic and regularized character, different from the episodic mobilization of the earliest medieval inquisitions. The censorship system was one of the most relevant areas of the Roman Inquisition. From its foundation, the congregation took on the task of supervising publications, authorizing or prohibiting books, and controlling the diffusion of ideas considered dangerous. The mechanism was consolidated in 1559 with the publication of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, which listed works forbidden to Catholic faithful. This index was periodically updated, encompassing everything from writings by Protestant reformers to philosophical treatises, scientific works, and literature deemed immoral. Beyond the index, the Roman Inquisition established the printing license system, requiring many books to receive prior approval before being published in Catholic territories. The Holy Office's activity in Rome became marked by several celebrated trials. The case of Giordano Bruno, condemned and executed in 1600 for upholding philosophical and cosmological conceptions considered incompatible with doctrine, and that of Galileo Galilei in 1633, are the best known. Nonetheless, thousands of other lesser-known cases made up the congregation's daily routine. Accusations against priests suspected of heterodoxy, repression of spiritual movements such as Quietism and Jansenism, and vigilance over universities and seminaries. The tribunal thus became an essential instrument for shaping the intellectual and religious life of post-Tridentine Catholicism. The reach of the Roman Inquisition extended throughout Italy and also reached territories under strong papal influence, such as Malta and some regions of Central Europe. Unlike Spain and Portugal, where the monarchy had a dominant role, in Rome, the tribunal answered almost exclusively to the Pope, reflecting the centrality of the Church in directing doctrinal policies. This difference explains the continuity and durability of the Roman Holy Office, which remained in operation for centuries, even after the abolition of the Iberian Inquisitions. During the 18th century, with the advance of Enlightenment ideas and criticisms of ecclesiastical authoritarianism, the Roman Inquisition began to face increasing pressures. States such as France, Austria, and the United Provinces restricted its activity, while intellectuals denounced its methods of censorship. Even so, the congregation survived and continued to operate, adapting to new circumstances. In the 19th century, even after the loss of the Papal States and Italian unification, the Holy Office was not abolished, remaining as an organ of the Roman Curia. The final transformation occurred in 1908, when Pope Pius VI reorganized the Curia and reformulated the Congregation of the Holy Office. The institution lost part of its repressive character and assumed functions more oriented toward doctrinal supervision and the defense of the faith in theological rather than judicial terms. This change marked the formal end of the Roman Inquisition as a tribunal in the old molds, but its legacy remained present. In 1965, during the Second Vatican Council, it was renamed the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, a title it maintains to this day, although with functions adapted to the contemporary world. Therefore, between 1542 and 1908, the Roman Inquisition was the Church's central arm in the fight against heresy and in cultural and intellectual control. Its strength lay in its centrality in Rome, its direct link with the Pope, and the censorship system that shaped Catholic thought for centuries. Unlike the Iberian experiences, it did not depend on monarchies but on papal authority itself, consolidating itself as a global tribunal of the faith and leaving a lasting mark on the history of the Church and European culture. The trial of Galileo Galilei in 1633 became one of the most emblematic episodes in the history of the Roman Inquisition and, at the same time, a lasting symbol of the conflict between science and religion. The Italian astronomer, born in Pisa in 1564, dedicated his life to mathematical studies and astronomical observations that led him to defend the heliocentric model of Nicolaus Copernicus. This model stated that the Earth and the other planets revolved around the Sun, in direct contradiction with the traditional geocentric view based on the authority of Aristotle and Ptolemy and supported by the literal reading of biblical passages. By publicly defending these ideas, Galileo came into collision with the Inquisition, which saw in his doctrine a threat to the official interpretation of the Scriptures. Heliocentrism was not merely a scientific question, but also a theological one. Biblical texts such as the book of Joshua, chapter 10, verse 12, where it is written that the sun stood still in the sky, were interpreted as proof that the sun moved around the earth. To sustain the opposite seemed, to many 17th century theologians, an attack on the truth of the Scriptures. The Inquisition, concerned with preserving orthodoxy after the Council of Trent, considered it dangerous to admit that the Bible could be interpreted in a non-literal way in matters of cosmology. Thus, the dispute transcended the limits of science and touched the very heart of ecclesiastical authority. Tensions between Galileo and the Church intensified, beginning in 1616, when the Holy Office declared heliocentrism to be false and contrary to the Scriptures. Galileo then received a formal warning not to teach or defend the Copernican theory as truth. For a few years he acted with prudence, but in 1632 he published the Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, a work in which, through a fictional debate between characters, he demonstrated the merits of heliocentrism and ridiculed the defenders of geocentrism. The book was interpreted as a direct affront to the earlier prohibition and also as an implicit criticism of Pope Urban V, who had initially supported Galileo. Faced with the scandal, the Inquisition opened proceedings. Galileo was summoned to Rome and interrogated several times between April and June of 1633. In the records of the trial, it is possible to see the effort of the inquisitors to make him admit that he had disobeyed the 1616 order. Confronted with the threat of a more severe condemnation, Galileo eventually publicly abjured his convictions. On June 22, 1633, kneeling before the tribunal, he declared that he rejected, cursed, and detested the doctrine that the earth moves around the sun. This abjuration saved his life, but cost him his intellectual freedom. He was condemned to lifelong house arrest, a sentence he served in residences near Florence until his death in 1642. The sentence against Galileo did not mean the extinction of his ideas. On the contrary, his writings continued to circulate, and his scientific discoveries, such as the observations of the phases of Venus and the moons of Jupiter, confirmed the validity of the heliocentric model. What the trial demonstrated was the difficulty the Church had in dealing with profound changes in the conception of the universe. Heliocentrism challenged not only the literal interpretation of the Bible, but also the Aristotelian structure of thought that had sustained centuries of scholastic tradition. The fear that acceptance of the new cosmology might open the door to broader questions led the Church to act with severity. The consequences for the relationship between science and the Church were profound. The trial of 1633 became a symbol of the Church's distrust of autonomous scientific investigation. For centuries, it was cited as an example of the danger of intellectual censorship and the submission of reason to dogmatic authority. Only in 1822 was heliocentrism officially accepted as compatible with the Catholic faith, and in 1992, Pope John Paul II recognized the errors committed against Galileo, rehabilitating his memory. For contemporaries, the trial left ambiguous lessons. On one hand, it showed the limits of free thought in a time when orthodoxy still dominated. On the other, it reinforced the conviction that scientific truth could not be silenced indefinitely. Galileo, even condemned, became a central figure in the history of science, remembered as a martyr of intellectual freedom. His trial represents the crossroads between tradition and innovation, between religious authority and the emerging scientific method. Thus, Galileo's case in 1633 synthesizes the conflict between faith and reason at the dawn of modernity. The forced abjuration, the restrictions imposed, and the lasting effects on the image of the Church demonstrate how the Holy Office, in attempting to preserve orthodoxy, ended up creating an episode that would become a universal symbol of the struggle for the autonomy of scientific thought. Giordano Bruno was born in 1548 in Nola, in the Kingdom of Naples, and entered the Dominican order while still young. From early on, he stood out for his intelligence and philosophical restlessness, but also for his tendency to question scholastic tradition and monastic discipline. This critical stance led him to leave the convent and begin a wandering trajectory through Europe, marked by debates, publications, and conflicts. Bruno became known for his bold ideas about cosmology, natural philosophy, and religion, ideas that would ultimately bring him under the judgment of the Roman Inquisition and lead to his execution in 1600. In the field of natural philosophy, Bruno broke with the limits of Aristotelian cosmology and the geocentric theory inherited from Ptolemy. Influenced by Copernicus's heliocentrism, he went a step further. He argued that the universe was infinite, populated by innumerable inhabited worlds. This conception undermined the traditional notion of a finite and hierarchical cosmos, upheld both by Aristotelian philosophy and by Christian theology. For Bruno, the universe was the infinite expression of the divinity itself, and each star was a sun around which planets and forms of life could exist. This cosmic vision anticipated modern conceptions, but for the 16th century, it sounded heretical and subversive. The theological consequences of his ideas were serious. If the universe was infinite and possessed countless worlds, what became of the centrality of the earth in the history of salvation? How could the incarnation of Christ be interpreted if there might be multiple humanities? By expanding cosmology beyond accepted limits, Bruno put at risk central foundations of Catholic doctrine. Moreover, in his works and debates, he attacked the Church's dogmatic rigidity, advocating a freer religiosity, spiritual and closer to nature. This stance earned him accusations of denying dogmas such as the Trinity, the virginity of Mary, and transubstantiation, elements central to the Catholic faith. During his wandering life, Bruno passed through cities such as Geneva, Paris, London, Wittenberg, and Prague, debating with both Protestants and Catholics. Nowhere did he find lasting refuge, for his ideas were controversial in every milieu. In Paris, he impressed with his teaching on mnemotechnics and philosophy. In London, he published works such as The Ash Wednesday Supper and On the Infinite, the Universe and the Worlds, in which he set out his cosmological thought. But he also collected enemies, both for his intellectual boldness and for his combative personality. In 1591, he accepted the invitation of a Venetian nobleman and returned to Italy, believing he could teach and live in relative safety. However, he was denounced to the Venetian Inquisition, accused of heresy and arrested in 1592. Later, he was transferred to Rome, where he faced a long trial that lasted 7 years. The interrogations focused on his theological and cosmological doctrines, and the records show that Bruno did not recant. Unlike Galileo, who in 1633 abjured his convictions to escape the death penalty, Bruno held firm to his position. In 1600, the Tribunal of the Holy Office declared him an impenitent heretic. He was handed over to the secular arm and condemned to be burned, being executed on February 17th in the Campo de' Fiori in Rome. Witnesses report that he faced death with courage and refused a final abjuration. His execution was recorded as a triumph of orthodoxy over intellectual rebelliousness, but it also became, over the centuries, a symbol of intolerance against freedom of thought. Giordano Bruno's condemnation was motivated not only by his innovative cosmology, but by the sum of his transgressions, denial of central dogmas, defense of a natural philosophy that broke with Aristotelian tradition, and an insistence on upholding his ideas before inquisitorial authority. For the 16th century Church, in the midst of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, tolerating such positions would open dangerous breaches for the contestation of orthodoxy. His legacy, however, surpassed his death. In the centuries that followed, Bruno was reinterpreted as a martyr of science and a precursor of modern thought. Enlightenment philosophers exalted him as an example of resistance against obscurantism, and 19th century scientists saw in him anticipations of later astronomical hypotheses. In the 20th century, his figure came to symbolize the defense of intellectual freedom. Although his ideas were more philosophical and speculative than strictly scientific, his courage in the face of condemnation and his vision of an infinite universe left an indelible mark on the history of Western culture. Thus, the trial and execution of Giordano Bruno in 1600 exemplify the rigidity of the Roman Inquisition in controlling ideas and reveal the limits imposed on free thought at the dawn of modernity. His natural philosophy and alternative theology were seen as unacceptable threats, leading him to death. At the same time, his memory has crossed the centuries as both warning and inspiration, reminding us that the cost of intellectual innovation can be high, but that its seeds cannot be destroyed by fire. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, known as the Index of Prohibited Books, was officially instituted in 1559 by Pope Paul IV in the context of the Counter-Reformation and the decisions of the Council of Trent. Its purpose was to create a systematic catalogue of works whose reading was considered dangerous or heretical for Catholic faithful. For more than 4 centuries, until its abolition in 1966 by Pope Paul VI, the index functioned as an instrument of intellectual surveillance, regulating access to knowledge and defining the boundaries of orthodoxy. Censorship was not limited only to religious texts, but encompassed philosophy, science, literature, and politics, decisively interfering with the circulation of ideas in Europe and in the colonies. The criteria for prohibition were varied. First came the works of Protestant reformers, such as Martin Luther, John Calvin, and Ulrich Zwingli, who were considered direct enemies of the Catholic faith. Then followed books that attacked or ridiculed the Church, challenged central dogmas, or presented unauthorized interpretations of the Scriptures. The translation of the Bible into vernacular languages, without ecclesiastical authorization, was systematically prohibited, since it was feared that direct reading would encourage heretical interpretations. Works of philosophy that questioned the Aristotelian Thomist tradition, such as writings by Erasmus of Rotterdam, were also targeted by censorship, as well as scientific books that seemed to conflict with the official interpretation of the Scriptures. A peculiar aspect of the index was the system of expurgations. In many cases, it was not the entire work that was prohibited, but only certain passages. Thus, expurgated editions appeared, with censored or altered sections, authorized by the Holy Office for limited circulation. This mechanism showed the attempt to reconcile access to knowledge with the defense of orthodoxy. On the other hand, it also distorted the transmission of ideas, since readers had access only to partial texts. This practice contributed to shaping a culture of controlled and supervised reading. The effect of the index on intellectual life was profound. Many Catholic authors began to practice self-censorship, avoiding controversial topics, or adjusting their works so as not to come into conflict with orthodoxy. The creation of submission prefaces, in which writers declared obedience to the Church, became common. Teachers and students in Catholic universities had to follow lists of authorized works, which limited academic debate. The fear of being denounced for possessing or citing prohibited books restricted intellectual production and reinforced doctrinal uniformity. Despite the control, the clandestine circulation of prohibited books was a constant reality. Merchants, students, and travelers brought works from Protestant regions or from countries with less rigid censorship, such as the Netherlands. Private libraries of nobles, clergy, and intellectuals accumulated forbidden volumes, often hidden in secret compartments. This underground circulation fed curiosity and, paradoxically, increased the prestige of works included in the index. The forbidden book became an object of desire, a symbol of access to forbidden knowledge, showing how censorship also stimulated the pursuit of learning. Famous cases such as Galileo, whose work on heliocentrism was included in the index, or Enlightenment authors such as Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot reveal the scope of censorship. Texts that questioned absolutist politics, discussed freedom of conscience, or defended alternative scientific methods were regularly included. Thus, the index functioned not only as a defense of faith, but also as a barrier against philosophical and scientific modernity. The influence of this control was particularly strong in Iberian and Italian countries, where the Inquisition had greater presence. Over the centuries, the index was updated in dozens of editions. However, with the advance of the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, and the political transformations of the 18th century onward, its practical effectiveness diminished. Many states began to challenge or ignore the prohibitions, and civil censorship developed its own forms, sometimes stricter than religious ones. In the 19th century, with the strengthening of liberal movements, the index became the target of constant criticism, seen as a symbol of cultural backwardness and of the Church's resistance to modernity. Its abolition in 1966 marked the official end of more than 400 years of systematic ecclesiastical censorship. The decision reflected the new stance of the Catholic Church after the Second Vatican Council, which recognized the need for dialogue with science, philosophy, and modern culture. The end of the index did not erase, however, the effects its long existence had caused on generations of intellectuals and on the circulation of knowledge. In summary, the index of prohibited books between 1559 and 1966 was a central instrument of the Church's intellectual surveillance and control. By defining criteria of prohibition applying expurgations, inducing self-censorship, and stimulating clandestine circulation, it profoundly shaped the history of European and colonial culture. More than just a list, it represented a global system of censorship that left lasting marks on the relationship between religious power and freedom of thought. The autos da fe were the most visible and spectacular moment of the Inquisition. Unlike the secret stages of the process, which took place in prisons and interrogation rooms, the auto da fe was a public ceremony, carefully planned, that gathered the entire community around the reading of sentences, the proclamation of offences, and the application of penalties. Its function was not limited to the execution of religious justice. It was also a liturgical and political ritual, laden with symbolism, conceived to reaffirm the supremacy of the Catholic faith and to consolidate the authority of both the Church and the monarchy. Preparation for the auto da fe could last weeks. First, edicts were published summoning the population to attend and to collaborate with the tribunal, reminding everyone of the duty to denounce heretics and to attend the ceremonies as a demonstration of fidelity to the faith. Structures were erected in central squares and plazas, where platforms were set up for inquisitors, civil and ecclesiastical representatives, as well as places reserved for royalty when present. The environment was constructed as true theatre, reinforcing the solemnity and theatricality of punishment. The defendants appeared dressed in sanbenitos, coarse tunics painted with symbols alluding to their offences. The clothing immediately communicated to the crowd the nature of the crime. Crosses for those reconciled, flames for those condemned to death, demonic figures for those deemed obstinate. This visual language turned each body into a public sign, making guilt visible and exemplary. The liturgy proceeded with processions, sermons preached by selected clergy, and detailed readings of the sentences, which could stretch on for hours. The penalties applied varied. Many received spiritual penances, such as prayers, fasts, pilgrimages, and prolonged use of the sanbenito, which were to be fulfilled before the community. Others were condemned to temporary or perpetual imprisonment, to exile, and to the loss of property. The cases considered most serious ended with the handing over of the defendant to the secular arm, since the Church claimed not to shed blood. It then fell to the civil authorities to carry out the death sentence, usually by burning at the stake, with the symbolic justification of purification by fire. The execution could take place on the same day or shortly thereafter, but always in continuity with the public ceremony. The theatricality of the auto da fe had a clear pedagogical function, to transmit to the community the message that heresy was a crime against God and against the social order, and that exemplary punishment should serve as a warning. Collective fear was cultivated as a mechanism of discipline, causing each spectator to internalize the lesson and to maintain vigilance over oneself and one's neighbors. In this sense, the auto da fe was not only punishment but a spectacle of power, in which the victory of orthodoxy over error was staged. The presence of the monarchy reinforced the political character of the ritual. Kings and queens occupied places of prominence, legitimizing the ceremony and being legitimized by it as defenders of the faith. The pact between throne and altar became visible before the crowd, which understood repression as part of a larger project of religious and social unity. Thus, the auto da fe was also an instrument of political centralization, demonstrating that heresy would not be tolerated because it threatened not only the Church, but the very order of the state. Despite its repressive character, the auto da fe also offered space for reconciliation. Those who confessed and repented could be spared the most severe penalties and reintegrated into the community after fulfilling penances. This possibility reinforced the idea of divine mercy and functioned as an incentive for the accused to cooperate with the tribunal. Public reconciliation thus served as a counterpoint to punishment, balancing fear and hope. In cities such as Lisbon, Seville, and Valladolid, the auto da fe became events of enormous repercussion, drawing crowds. In the colonies, especially in Mexico and Peru, they were also held, reinforcing the global presence of the Inquisition. Documents of the time report ceremonies that gathered hundreds of defendants and crowds of spectators in events that lasted the entire day. Thus, the autos da fe synthesized the inquisitorial logic. Justice, liturgy, and politics united in a single ritual. They were a spectacle of power that communicated the victory of orthodoxy, disciplined society, and kept alive the memory of punishment. Their legacy remains one of the strongest symbols of the Inquisition, a reminder of how repression was transformed into public theater to mold consciences and ensure social control. The prisons of the Inquisition were an essential part of the functioning of the Holy Office. More than simple places of custody, they were spaces of discipline, intimidation, and psychological preparation of the defendant for interrogations and sentences. Located in buildings annexed to the tribunals of Lisbon, Coimbra, Évora, Seville, Valladolid, Toledo, and many other cities, inquisitorial prisons were described in contemporary testimonies and administrative records that reveal their daily functioning. The analysis of their architecture, living conditions, and the forms of interaction between prisoners, families, and inquisitors makes it possible to understand how imprisonment became part of the repressive machinery of the Inquisition. The architecture varied according to the tribunal, but followed common principles. There were individual cells for absolute isolation, especially reserved for prisoners considered dangerous or obstinate, and collective cells where detainees waited in groups. The cells were small with little light, limited ventilation, and furniture reduced to the minimum necessary: a cot, a blanket, and sometimes a rustic chair or table. Some inquisitorial prisons were located in old adapted fortresses, others in buildings constructed for this purpose. The physical environment, dark and damp, reinforced the sensation of punishment even before the final sentence. The isolation regime was one of the most striking features. Many defendants spent weeks or months without contact with the outside world, except for visits from jailers and interrogators. This isolation aimed to break psychological resistance, making the accused more susceptible to confession. In some cases, limited interaction between prisoners was permitted, but always under surveillance. Testimonies in letters and memoirs indicate that silence and solitude were weapons as strong as interrogations. The fear of the unknown, the expectation of sentencing, and the absence of family news created an atmosphere of permanent anguish. Health and nutrition conditions also reflected the punitive logic. Meals were simple, consisting of bread, broth, and occasionally meat or fish, depending on region and time. Many prisoners complained about the poor quality of food and the scarcity of drinking water. Diseases spread easily, aggravated by humidity, lack of hygiene, and prolonged confinement. On some occasions, families could send food and clothing, but this depended on the benevolence of the inquisitors and the economic condition of relatives. Prisoners without external support suffered in even more precarious conditions, revealing how prison reinforced social inequalities. One little remembered but fundamental aspect was the exchange of letters. Many prisoners wrote petitions to the authorities of the Holy Office, begging for clemency, better living conditions, or permission to contact relatives. Other letters, sent secretly or delivered by corrupt jailers, reveal feelings of despair, hope, or denunciations of injustice. These letters are today a precious source for historians, as they allow us to hear the voices of the accused and to understand their subjective experience. They show how prisons were not only spaces of silence, but also of resistance, where the accused tried as far as possible to negotiate their survival. Family mediation played an important role in this process. Relatives sought to intercede with the tribunal, offering guarantees, requesting lighter penalties, or sending resources to improve prison conditions. Often entire families were affected by the detention of one member, not only because of social stigma, but also because of the confiscation of goods, which left widows and orphans in misery. Thus, the prisons did not only affect individuals, but had repercussions on entire family and community networks, broadening the reach of repression. Although inquisitorial prisons were known for their severity, records show that in some cases, defendants were treated with relative dignity, especially when they belonged to prestigious social groups or when they showed willingness to cooperate. This reveals that even in their harshness, the prisons were not uniform. There was room for negotiations, privileges, and exceptions. This flexibility, however, did not lessen the intimidating character of the system, which made imprisonment an integral part of collective disciplining. In summary, the prisons of the Inquisition were not only waiting places, but active instruments of repression. Their architecture, their isolation regime, their health and food practices, the correspondence of prisoners, and family mediation reveal a daily life marked by the attempt to break resistance and to mold behavior. Imprisonment was part of the inquisitorial ritual, preceding the public trial and contributing to the atmosphere of fear that sustained the institution. More than a physical space, it represented the extension of inquisitorial logic into the body and mind of the accused. One of the least remembered yet fundamental aspects of the Inquisition's functioning was the way the defense of the accused was organized. Contrary to what popular memory often conveys, defendants were not completely deprived of formal defense mechanisms, although these were extremely limited and conditioned by inquisitorial logic. The Holy Office allowed the presence of legal agents and court-appointed defenders, but their work took place within a legal framework in which the presumption of guilt was strong and the authority of the inquisitors virtually unquestionable. Even so, this system of defense revealed contradictions and, in some cases, opened spaces, however small, that the accused tried to exploit. The first instrument of defense was the possibility for the defendant to appoint legal agents. These legal representatives were responsible for drafting petitions, following the proceedings and checking formal aspects. However, their work could not question the foundations of the accusation, nor openly contest the authority of the tribunal. They were generally limited to requesting mitigation of penalties, asking for better prison conditions, or pointing out procedural flaws. The room for a defense on the merits was minimal, since theological and doctrinal issues were under the control of the inquisitors and specialized consultants. There were also court-appointed defenders, lawyers named by the tribunal itself to ensure that the defendant had legal assistance. These defenders were members of the corps of learned men connected to the Inquisition, which compromised their independence. In many cases, their role was more formal than effective, acting as part of the Holy Office's machinery. Even so, there are records of defenders who made efforts to point out contradictions in witness statements or to argue in favor of the sincerity of their client's repentance, which could save lives by turning capital sentences into spiritual penances. The record of interrogations was another crucial element. Every statement was meticulously recorded by notaries, and defendants had the right to consult their own declarations, being able to submit corrections or point out misunderstandings. This practice allowed some defendants to better align their narrative, even though they were under enormous psychological pressure. The written record also made it possible for lawyers to identify inconsistencies or contradictions in the sequence of statements, a strategy that, in some cases, resulted in the revision of charges or in more lenient penalties. Contradictions among witnesses were, in fact, one of the main possible openings for the defense. Since inquisitorial proceedings relied largely on denunciations and testimonies, a lack of coherence among different accounts could weaken the accusation. Defendants and their legal agents tried to exploit these discrepancies, showing that the statements were driven by personal rivalries, envy, or enmities. Although it was not always enough to acquit an accused person, this kind of defense could avert the death penalty and result in less severe punishments, such as fines, public penances, or temporary imprisonment. Another important recourse was the possibility of appealing to the Roman Curia. Since the Roman Inquisition, through the Congregation of the Holy Office, was the supreme authority, defendants in local tribunals on the Iberian Peninsula or in the colonies could appeal to Rome seeking a review of their sentences. This appeal, however, was difficult, costly, and slow, as it required political contacts, financial support, and networks of intermediation. Some famous cases, such as that of Father Antonio Vieira, reveal how influential figures managed to mobilize this recourse and obtain a review of their convictions. For most defendants, however, this path was inaccessible, remaining only a theoretical possibility. The defense in inquisitorial proceedings, therefore, existed formally, but operated within a restrictive framework. The defendant had the right to appoint legal agents and court-appointed defenders and to consult the records of his interrogations, but he could not freely choose defense witnesses nor question the theological foundations of the accusation. The structural inequality was evident. On one side, the tribunal with all its authority and legal apparatus. On the other, the accused, isolated, weakened, and with narrow margins for contestation. Even so, the mere fact that there was room for petitions, written memoranda, and appeals demonstrated the complexity of the inquisitorial system. It was not a mechanism of absolute arbitrary punishment, but a tribunal with procedures, codes, and formalities that, paradoxically, could also be used by the more skillful or better connected defendants. This ambivalence helps explain why some accused escaped with light penalties, while others, without effective defense or support, were led to the stake. In summary, the defendant's defense in the Inquisition was part of the Holy Office's legal theatre, limited, subordinated, and often symbolic, but not non-existent. Its function was to give an appearance of legality and justice to the proceedings while reinforcing inquisitorial power. In the few cases in which legal agents, defenders, or contradictions among witnesses managed to reduce penalties, it becomes evident that, even in a tribunal marked by intolerance, there were minimal spaces for negotiation, always controlled and supervised by the authority of the Holy Office. The Inquisition exercised special vigilance over women, both in Europe and in the colonies, because female religiosity was perceived as an ambiguous field. On the one hand, devotion, purity, and the role of women as symbols of faith were exalted. On the other hand, there was suspicion of their supposed fragility, their closeness to healing practices, and their predisposition to demonic influence. This ambiguity made women recurrent targets of inquisitorial processes, whether as pious women suspected of heresy, mystics who claimed to have divine visions, healers accused of witchcraft, or simple popular figures involved in networks of sociability that escaped clerical control. Pious women and mystics occupied a central position in this vigilance. Many women without access to formal monastic life dedicated themselves to intense devotional practices marked by fasting, prolonged prayers, and alleged mystical experiences. Some claimed to receive direct revelations from Christ or the Virgin Mary, attracting followers and arousing distrust among the clergy. For the Inquisition, such experiences could be interpreted as deceit, hysteria, or, in more serious cases, demonic influence. Trials against these women reveal the Holy Office's effort to control forms of religiosity, not mediated by ecclesiastical hierarchy. Healers and folk practitioners, in turn, were common figures in everyday life. They worked with prayers, herbs, ointments, and popular healing rituals. The line between Catholic devotion and witchcraft was thin. Many mixed prayers to saints with magical practices, which placed them under suspicion. When denounced, they were accused of resorting to occult forces, manipulating illnesses, and making pacts with the devil. This association between popular healing and witchcraft meant that countless women were investigated, especially in rural areas where the absence of doctors reinforced the importance of healers in attending to the population. The phenomenon of witchcraft affected women in a disproportionate way. Although men were also accused, the vast majority of trials for demonic pacts involved women. The belief that they were more vulnerable to sin and to the devil's seduction was based on theological and legal discourses that reinforced gender stigmas. In the reports, witches were described as participants in nocturnal Sabbaths, engaging in rituals of moral inversion and threatening the Christian order. Many of these accusations arose from community conflicts, personal rivalries, or simple gossip, but they were taken seriously by inquisitors as evidence of the presence of evil. Female networks of sociability were also subject to suspicion. Groups of women who gathered to pray, exchange healing practices, or share mystical experiences were seen as potential centers of heresy. The Inquisition feared that these networks would escape the authority of parish priests and turn into spaces of spiritual resistance. For this reason, it devoted special attention to monitoring gatherings, conventicles, and circles of pious women, especially when led by charismatic figures who attracted a large following. Gender stigmas pervaded all these processes. The idea that women were naturally weaker, more inclined to superstition, and less capable of rational discernment legitimized their greater exposure to the tribunal. This view reflected not only religious conceptions, but also patriarchal social structures in which control over the female body and voice was constant. By prosecuting women for witchcraft, mysticism, or healing, the Inquisition reinforced patterns of submission and silenced alternative forms of religious and social expression. In the colonies, this vigilance over women took on even more complex forms. Midwives, enslaved African women, and indigenous women who practiced pahilansa or calundus were subject to accusations similar to those made against European healers. The intersection between gender, race, and social status increased the vulnerability of these women, who could be accused both for their subordinate condition and for their connection with non-Christian religious traditions. Thus the Inquisition projected onto them not only the fear of heresy but also colonial control. Despite the repression, many women managed to survive and even negotiate their position before the tribunal. Some partially admitted the accusations, asked for forgiveness and were condemned only to public penances. Others denounced neighbors, transferring guilt and securing their reconciliation. There are also records of women who resisted firmly, denying the accusations to the end and facing the harshest punishments. These trajectories reveal the diversity of female responses to inquisitorial violence. In summary, the relationship between women and the Inquisition was marked by inequalities, stigmas, and gender-specific repressions. The tribunal monitored their mystical experiences, condemned their healing practices, associated them with witchcraft, and distrusted their networks of sociability. In doing so, it reinforced social and religious control over the female figure, turning her into a privileged target of repression. Even so, the presence of women in inquisitorial processes also shows their centrality in the spiritual and community life of the time, making them involuntary protagonists of a history of vigilance, resistance, and survival. The Inquisition was not limited to monitoring new Christians of Jewish origin. Over the centuries, several other minority groups became constant targets of suspicion and repression. Moriscos, Roma, Gypsies, enslaved Africans and descendants of indigenous peoples faced inquisitorial surveillance to varying degrees, always based on the logic that their cultural or religious identity posed a risk to the uniformity of the Catholic faith. The Holy Office's actions toward these communities reveal how religion, race, and social position intertwined in mechanisms of exclusion and control. The Moriscos, descendants of Muslims converted to Christianity in the Iberian Peninsula, remained under constant distrust after the forced conversions of the 15th and 16th centuries. Although officially Christian, they were accused of secretly maintaining Islamic practices, such as reciting prayers in Arabic, abstaining from pork, or fasting during Ramadan. In Spain, especially after the Alpujarras rebellion between 1568 and 1571, surveillance of the Moriscos intensified. Many were tried by the Inquisition, deported or forcibly assimilated. In Portugal, the pressure was smaller in scale, but persecution also occurred, marked by the stigma of origin and the impossibility of full social advancement. The Roma, in turn, were the target of discriminatory policies that associated their mobility and ways of life with suspicion of heresy and witchcraft. The Inquisition monitored cultural practices, such as music, dance, and folk healing, interpreting them as signs of superstition. Moreover, the fact that they moved across borders and maintained their own communal ties aroused fear among authorities, who saw in the Roma a threat to social and religious order. Trials against individuals from this group show how they were accused of charlatanry, fortune-telling, and demonic pacts, reinforcing stereotypes that persisted for centuries. Enslaved African populations also came under inquisitorial scrutiny. Transported to Portugal, Spain, and especially to the American colonies, Africans brought with them traditional religions based on the worship of deities, ancestors, and forces of nature. In contact with imposed Catholicism, many created syncretic forms of religiosity, blending Christian prayers with African rituals. The Inquisition interpreted these practices as witchcraft or heresy. Records of trials in Brazil, for example, mention calundas and healing dances as proof of demonic involvement. The tribunal not only repressed these expressions, but also reinforced the racial and social marginalization of enslaved Africans. In the Americas, indigenous peoples were also affected by inquisitorial logic, although to a lesser extent than new Christians and Africans. Pajelanzas, healing rituals, and native cosmologies were seen as idolatry and superstition. Jesuit missionaries often denounced practices considered incompatible with the Catholic faith, and the Inquisition indirectly supervised these cases. Even if they were rarely brought to trial in Lisbon or Seville, indigenous people were subject to constant disciplining, being forced to abandon age-old religious traditions under threat of punishment. The common denominator among all these minorities was the association between cultural difference and spiritual risk. Moriscos, Roma, Africans, and indigenous people were identified as others within a society that sought religious homogeneity. This condition made them vulnerable not only to inquisitorial repression, but also to social, economic, and political exclusion. Accusations often overlapped with racial and caste prejudices, creating a system in which faith was used as a justification for maintaining hierarchies of power. Forced conversions were a recurring instrument in this process. Moriscos, Jews, and Africans alike were baptized en masse, often without any proper instruction. Far from guaranteeing inclusion, conversion served as a surveillance mechanism. Once Christian, these groups remained under constant suspicion of relapsing into former practices. The Inquisition assumed the role of guardian of this conversion, punishing any sign of return to the previous religion. In this sense, faith functioned as a device of social control and affirmation of cultural superiority. In summary, the Inquisition acted upon minorities selectively, yet always reinforcing stigmas of origin. Moriscos were suspected because of their Islamic heritage, Roma because of their mobility and cultural practices, Africans because of their ancestral rituals, and indigenous people because of their spiritual traditions. By treating them as potential heretics, the Holy Office consolidated a system in which religion, race, and caste intertwined, legitimizing exclusions and disciplining entire communities. Thus, inquisitorial repression went beyond the defense of faith and became an integral part of the power and hierarchy structures that marked Iberian and colonial society. Although the Inquisition is often associated with the Iberian Peninsula, its presence extended to different regions of Europe under the control or influence of the Iberian kingdoms and the Roman Church itself. Italy, Malta, Sardinia, Sicily, and the Spanish Netherlands experienced specific inquisitorial practices, adapted to their political and social realities. These variations reveal how the Holy Office functioned as a flexible institution, at times reinforcing papal power, at times serving monarchical centralization, and at other times facing local resistance. In Italy, the Roman Inquisition, established in 1542, was directly responsible for overseeing cities such as Venice, Florence, Bologna, and Rome. The Italian peninsula, fragmented into multiple states, required differentiated approaches. Venice, for example, tried to preserve its autonomy and limited Roman intervention, but eventually conceded partially to inquisitorial control. The local Venetian tribunal became famous for its relative moderation, preferring warnings and fines over the death penalty, although it also recorded severe cases. In Rome, the Holy Office centralized famous trials, such as those of Giordano, Bruno, and Galileo, turning the city into a symbol of intellectual and doctrinal repression. In Malta, under the rule of the Order of the Knights of St. John, the Inquisition was established in 1561 by papal decision. The small island territory, strategically located in the Mediterranean, became the stage for intense vigilance. The Inquisitors of Malta had jurisdiction over a cosmopolitan society composed of knights, sailors, merchants, and enslaved people. Cases of blasphemy, bigamy, and magical practices were common, but Malta's specificity lay in the repression of religious interactions with Muslims and Orthodox Christians, since the island was in constant contact with the Islamic world through trade and war. In Sardinia and Sicily, the Inquisition was introduced in the 15th century under the rule of the Crown of Aragon and later integrated into the Spanish monarchy. On these islands, the tribunals operated similarly to those of the Iberian Peninsula, persecuting new Christians, heretics, and practitioners of witchcraft. Sicily, in particular, was the stage for numerous autos de fe, which gathered crowds in Palermo and other cities. The local tribunals enjoyed a certain degree of autonomy, but followed the same repressive logic as Seville and Toledo, reinforcing the uniformity of the Spanish system. In the Spanish Netherlands, the attempt to establish the Inquisition encountered fierce resistance. The population, largely influenced by Calvinism and reformist currents, rejected the authority of the Holy Office. The repression against Protestants, initiated by Philip II, directly contributed to the outbreak of the Dutch Revolt in 1568, which would lead to the independence of the northern United Provinces. In this region, the Inquisition became a symbol of Spanish oppression, and its rejection fueled anti-Spanish propaganda, the so-called Black Legend of the Inquisition, which spread across Europe. Each of these regions demonstrates how the geography of the Inquisition went beyond the Iberian Peninsula, but assumed different forms. In Italy, papal centrality prevailed. In Malta, The tribunal dealt with constant contact between religions. In Sicily and Sardinia, the institution reinforced Spanish domination, and in the Netherlands, the attempt at repression ended up strengthening the struggle for independence. In all cases, the Inquisition adapted to political and social conditions, but always with the same logic of vigilance over the faith and control of populations. Thus, the expansion of the Inquisition beyond the Iberian Peninsula highlights its transnational character, linked both to papal power and to Catholic monarchies. This geographical diversity reinforces the idea that the institution was not uniform, but shaped itself to local contexts, serving as an instrument of power in distinct territories, always marked by the same purpose: preserving orthodoxy and disciplining entire societies. The Inquisition, in any of its variations, never acted in isolation. Its effectiveness depended on a close relationship with secular power, both at the level of monarchies and of local administrations. This pact between throne and altar was the foundation on which inquisitorial repression was built. But it also generated constant tensions, since the boundaries between ecclesiastical jurisdiction and civil authority were not always clearly defined. Thus, the history of the Inquisition is also the history of negotiations between two spheres that sought to assert supremacy: the spiritual, represented by the Holy Office, and the temporal, embodied by monarchies and municipal authorities. The pact between throne and altar guaranteed the Inquisition not only legitimacy, but also the practical means to enforce its decisions. The imprisonment of defendants, the confiscation of goods, and above all the execution of capital sentences required the secular arm. The Church proclaimed that it did not shed blood, so those condemned to death were handed over to civil officials who carried out the executions. This collaboration symbolized the union between faith and political power, in which the monarchy presented itself as guardian of orthodoxy and the Inquisition as the tribunal authorized to preserve the spiritual integrity of the kingdom. However, there were competing jurisdictions. In many cities, municipal councils and magistrates resented the presence of inquisitors who limited their traditional prerogatives. Disputes arose over the right to arrest individuals, confiscate property, or collect revenues resulting from condemnations. In some cases, local authorities tried to restrict inquisitorial activity or delayed the execution of its orders. These conflicts show that the Holy Office was not automatically accepted, but had to continuously negotiate its presence. Municipal resistance was particularly visible in peripheral or autonomous regions. Venice, for example, limited the action of the Roman Inquisition, preserving space for its own magistrates. In the Netherlands, the Spanish attempt to impose the Inquisition generated open revolt, contributing to the outbreak of the Wars of Independence. In the interior of Portugal and Spain, towns and villages protested against abuses by inquisitorial officials, such as arbitrary arrests or excessive charges. These movements did not seek to abolish the Inquisition itself, but to defend legal boundaries they considered threatened. Royal power, in turn, oscillated between support and control. Iberian monarchs used the Inquisition as a political instrument, reinforcing their centralization and presenting themselves as defenders of the faith. However, they also sought to subject the tribunal to their interests. The Grand Inquisitor in Portugal, often a member of the royal family, symbolized this fusion of instances. In Spain, the Supreme Council of the Inquisition was subordinated to the king, who exercised strong influence over its composition and decisions. Thus, the institution served both religious orthodoxy and the consolidation of absolutism. The negotiation of legal boundaries was constant. It was about defining how far inquisitorial prerogatives went and where civil responsibilities began. The issue of confiscated goods illustrates this tension well. Although they reverted in part to the Holy Office, the resources also interested the Crown and local administrations, generating disputes over distribution. Another delicate point was the imprisonment of people of prestige, such as nobles or high officials. In such cases, the Inquisition had to act cautiously, negotiating with secular power to avoid conflicts that could destabilize political alliances. This ambiguous relationship of cooperation and rivalry shows that the Inquisition was not only a religious tribunal, but also an institution deeply embedded in politics. Its ability to watch and punish depended on civil support, but at the same time, It threatened established spheres of power. It was this dynamic tension that allowed the institution to survive for centuries, adapting to different contexts and consolidating its presence as an integral part of the state apparatus. In summary, the relationship of the Inquisition with secular power was marked by a delicate balance between cooperation and conflict. The pact between throne and altar gave strength to repression, but competing jurisdictions and municipal resistance revealed the limits of that power. By continuously negotiating its legal boundaries, the Holy Office became one of the pillars of the political and religious order of the early modern period, proof that faith and power walked together, albeit in constant dispute. The Inquisition, although it had as its central mission the defense of the Catholic faith, did not operate in a political vacuum. Its existence and methods were inserted into a Europe marked by confessional rivalries, religious wars, and complex diplomatic games. France, England, the United Provinces, and several Italian states closely followed inquisitorial activity, and in many cases transformed it into a weapon of propaganda or a subject of diplomatic disputes. Thus, the institution not only shaped internal life within Catholic territories, but also influenced international relations and was constantly the target of external criticism and pressure. In France, where Catholics and Protestant Huguenots lived in permanent tension, the presence of the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisition was viewed with suspicion. Although the country did not establish an inquisitorial tribunal modeled on the Iberian version, the French monarchy used secular and ecclesiastical courts to persecute Protestants. At the same time, French intellectuals and diplomats criticized the harshness of the Iberian Holy Office, especially after episodes such as the execution of foreign heretics or the repression of Frenchmen accused of spreading reformed ideas on the peninsula. This criticism fed the negative image of the Inquisition as a symbol of Catholic tyranny. In England, after the consolidation of the Anglican Reformation under Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, the Inquisition became a central target of anti-Catholic propaganda. Pamphlets circulated describing inquisitorial methods in tones of horror, highlighting torture, burnings, and arbitrariness. This rhetoric was part of the construction of the Protestant English identity, which saw itself as a bastion of liberty against papal and Iberian despotism. The political hostility between England and Spain, marked by conflicts such as the defeat of the Armada in 1588, reinforced this use of the Inquisition as an example of alleged Catholic darkness. The United Provinces, which gained independence after a long war against Spain, also turned the Inquisition into a key element of propaganda. For the Dutch, the tribunal symbolized Spanish oppression and the tyranny of Philip II. Pamphlets and engravings circulated throughout northern Europe, depicting inquisitors as cruel executioners, fueling the so-called Black Legend of the Inquisition. This discourse not only justified rebellion, but also served as a diplomatic tool, presenting the independent Netherlands as defenders of liberty against Iberian authoritarianism. In the Italian states, the situation was more varied. Regions under direct Roman rule, such as the Papal States, lived under the close presence of the Holy Office. Meanwhile, territories such as Venice sought to limit its activity, preserving political autonomy. The tensions between inquisitors and Venetian authorities show how the Inquisition could become a subject of diplomatic dispute even within the Catholic world. Venice sought to negotiate boundaries of power, accepting doctrinal vigilance, but refusing direct interference in civil and commercial affairs. This resistance demonstrates that the institution was not passively accepted, even among allies of the Church. Propaganda was one of the most powerful weapons in this context. Pamphlets, engravings, refugee accounts, and even popular literature spread images of the Inquisition as a tribunal of blood. Often these texts exaggerated or invented practices, but they were effective in creating a negative collective memory. At the same time, Catholic apologists wrote defenses of the Inquisition, arguing that its objective was the salvation of souls and that its methods were milder than those of secular courts. This dispute of narratives became an integral part of the confessional battles of the early modern period. Diplomatic pressures also arose in concrete cases. When foreigners were arrested by the Iberian Inquisition, ambassadors intervened with the tribunals, demanding their release or more lenient treatment. These negotiations reveal how the Holy Office was not isolated, but embedded in international networks of power. At times, the tension between defending orthodoxy and avoiding diplomatic crises led inquisitors to yield, especially when it concerned subjects of important powers. In summary, the Inquisition transcended religious boundaries and became an international political issue. France, England, the United Provinces, and the Italian states used its image as a tool of dispute, whether to attack enemies, justify rebellions, or reinforce national identities. The tribunal, in turn, had to deal with these external pressures while maintaining its internal function of vigilance. This interaction between religious repression and diplomacy shows that the Holy Office was an active part of the European stage, not only through the force of its condemnations, but also through the symbolic weight it acquired in the confessional and political disputes of the time. The quantitative study of the Inquisition is a subject of great historiographical debate. For a long time, the dominant image was that of a tribunal executing in mass, reducing the institution to a symbol of indiscriminate violence. However, systematic analysis of inquisitorial archives, beginning in the 20th century, revealed a more complex picture. Statistics show that the Holy Office prosecuted tens of thousands of people over the course of its existence, but that the rates of death sentences, although significant, were not as high as traditional narratives suggested. This does not diminish the repressive character of the institution, but it forces us to understand its mechanisms of power beyond absolute numbers. In Spain, where the Inquisition was most active, modern estimates point to around 150,000 trials between the end of the 15th century and the beginning of the 19th century. Of these, approximately 2 to 3% resulted in execution by fire. In Portugal, the numbers were smaller, ranging between 40 and 45,000 trials over nearly 3 centuries, with a similar rate of capital sentences. Most defendants received alternative punishments, such as public penances, fines, wearing of San Benito's, temporary imprisonment or exile. This shows that the Holy Office functioned both as a court of extreme punishment and as a mechanism of everyday discipline, whose impact was measured not only in deaths, but also in social stigmas and widespread fear. The mortality of the Inquisition must be contextualized. Although the percentage of executions was relatively low in relation to the total number of trials, each auto da fe had enormous public repercussions. The spectacle of a burning, even if it involved only a few condemned individuals, deeply marked the collective memory and served as an example for thousands of spectators. Thus, the power of the Holy Office lay not only in the volume of executions, but in the theatricality of punishment, which projected fear far beyond the real number of deaths. The methodological challenges are significant. Many records were lost or destroyed, and the sources available require critical reading. Books of confessions, auto da fe records, and inquisitors' reports provide fragmented data, which must be cross-checked to estimate the scale of repression. Moreover, numbers varied depending on the region and the period. The 16th century, marked by the Counter-Reformation, saw greater repressive intensity, while the 17th and 18th centuries experienced progressive decline, with a stronger focus on censorship of books and vigilance of customs. Another important aspect is the revision of the so-called quantitative myth. Enlightenment and Protestant traditions, eager to attack the Catholic Church, inflated death tolls, presenting the Inquisition as responsible for millions of executions. These exaggerated estimates consolidated the black legend of the institution, used as a weapon of political and religious propaganda. Contemporary historiography, without denying the real violence, seeks to correct this picture, offering more precise numbers based on documentation. The impact of the Inquisition, scholars argue, cannot be measured only by the number of victims, but by the extent of its cultural and social control. Debates about statistics also raise questions about who the preferred targets were. New Christians made up a large part of those prosecuted in Portugal, while in Spain cases of converts, Protestants, and later morality and blasphemy predominated. In both countries, women accused of witchcraft, healing practices, or unauthorized devotions also represented a significant number of defendants. This diversity reveals that the Inquisition did not persecute only one minority, but became a tribunal capable of surveilling broad sectors of society. Therefore, the numbers of the Inquisition must be read on two levels. On the one hand, corrected statistics dismantle propagandistic exaggerations, and show that the tribunal executed thousands, not millions of people. On the other, the true reach of the institution cannot be reduced to figures. Its strength resided in the combination of selective repression and generalized surveillance, capable of shaping behavior and sustaining a culture of fear for centuries. The Inquisition, in addition to being a historical institution, also became a powerful object of memory and symbolic dispute. Since the 16th century, different groups have constructed narratives about the Holy Office, either to denounce its violence or to defend it as a legitimate instrument for the preservation of faith. This dispute gave rise to what became known as the Black Legend of the Inquisition, an image full of exaggerations, but one that consolidated in the European imagination as a synonym for intolerance and cruelty. At the same time, there were Catholic apologies that sought to minimize inquisitorial repression, describing it as a relatively moderate court compared to other forms of justice of the time. These contradictory memories crossed the centuries and continue to influence how the Inquisition is remembered and represented in different cultural contexts. The Black Legend arose mainly in Protestant countries and in regions that resisted Spanish domination. In England, the United Provinces, and Huguenot France, pamphlets, engravings, and reports multiplied descriptions of burnings, tortures, and inquisitorial brutality. These representations, often inflated or invented, had a clear political function: to present Iberian Catholicism as the enemy of freedom of conscience and to justify the struggle against Spain and Rome. Dutch propaganda, for example, intensely exploited images of autos de fe and tortured prisoners, transforming the Holy Office into an icon of oppression. In contrast, Catholic apologies arose, especially from the 17th century onward. Defenders of the Inquisition claimed that the court was more just and less bloody than contemporary civil courts. They argued that the Holy Office offered opportunities for defense, avoided mass executions, and sought reconciliation of the accused with the Church. This apologetic view was taken up again by Catholic scholars in the 20th century, who sought to relativize the image of absolute terror and place the Inquisition in its historical context, without denying, however, the abuses and intolerance it practiced. Literature played an important role in shaping inquisitorial memory. Romantic and Enlightenment writers portrayed the court as a stage of horrors. Voltaire, in his Candide, mocked the auto da fe in Lisbon after the 1755 earthquake, turning it into a symbol of religious absurdity. In the 19th century, historical novels and theatrical plays continued to portray the Inquisition as the enemy of reason and freedom. In the 20th century, cinema and television popularized this vision, with films that explored the atmosphere of fear, cruel interrogations, and spectacular executions. These representations helped cement in the collective imagination the image of a relentless court. At the same time, the memory of the Inquisition was politically exploited in different contexts. During the French Revolution, the Holy Office was invoked as an example of oppression that needed to be overcome. In the 19th century, Spanish liberals denounced the Inquisition as a symbol of the backwardness that had to be eliminated to modernize the country. In Portugal, liberalism also appropriated this memory to justify political reforms and the definitive abolition of the tribunal in 1821. In the 20th century, both authoritarian regimes and democracies resorted to the image of the Inquisition to criticize opponents or denounce persecution, turning the tribunal into a metaphor for intolerance in general. The use of inquisitorial memory even reached contemporary debates. The expression witch hunt, for example, became a global metaphor for ideological persecution, especially during the Cold War, when McCarthyism in the United States was compared to the Inquisition. The tribunal came to symbolize not only religious repression of the past, but any form of intolerance and restriction of freedom of thought. This expansion of meaning reinforces the cultural power of the Black Legend, even when disconnected from the original historical context. In contrast, recent historiography seeks to balance memory and reality. Quantitative studies, archival analysis, and new interpretations aim to overcome propagandistic exaggerations and present the Holy Office as a complex institution with diverse practices that varied according to region and period. This revision does not erase the violence of the Inquisition, but helps us understand that its impact was not limited to burnings. It was also present in daily life, in censorship, in social discipline, and in the surveillance of behaviors. Thus, myths, memories, and narratives about the Inquisition reveal as much as documented facts. The tribunal became a symbol of intolerance and oppression, exalted by some, condemned by others, represented in literature and cinema, used in political disputes, and converted into a universal metaphor. The contemporary historiographical challenge is to distinguish between myth and reality, without denying that both are part of the cultural legacy left by the institution. From the 18th century onwards, the Inquisition entered a process of deep decline, provoked by the intellectual, political, and legal transformations that marked the so-called Age of Enlightenment. Enlightenment philosophy questioned not only the legitimacy of the Holy Office, but also the very principle that faith could be imposed by force. At the same time, new legal conceptions inspired by ideals of rationality and proportionality criticized the arbitrariness of inquisitorial punishments and demanded the secularization of justice. This set of factors triggered the crisis of legitimacy of the institution, which, although maintaining its formal structures, lost much of its power and prestige. The Enlightenment philosophers were the main protagonists of this criticism. Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Diderot denounced religious intolerance and presented freedom of conscience as an inalienable right. The Inquisition came to be used as the ultimate example of obscurantism, opposed to the Enlightenment project of rationality and progress. Pamphlets and literary works multiplied caricatures of the tribunal, portrayed as the enemy of science, reason, and humanity. This criticism was not limited to the theoretical field. It also became a political instrument of opposition to Catholic absolutism and the alliance between throne and altar. In the legal field, Enlightenment reforms introduced new principles of criminal justice that contrasted with inquisitorial methods. The Italian jurist Cesare Beccaria, in his 1764 work, On Crimes and Punishments, condemned torture and cruel executions, defending proportionality between crime and punishment. Although he did not specifically address the Inquisition, his criticism directly struck at the logic of the Holy Office, based on forced confessions and exemplary punishments. These ideals influenced legislation in several countries, undermining the legitimacy of a tribunal that remained anchored in practices seen as outdated. The secularization of justice also weakened the Inquisition. Reformist governments, inspired by enlightened despotism, began to limit ecclesiastical jurisdiction and transfer powers to civil courts. In Spain, under Charles III, and in Portugal, with the Marquis of Pombal, measures were adopted to reduce the autonomy of the Holy Office and subject it to the direct control of the monarchy. These reforms did not immediately abolish the institution, but transformed it into an increasingly subordinated instrument of the state, depriving it of part of the prestige and authority it had enjoyed in previous centuries. The crisis of legitimacy also manifested itself in public opinion. Accounts from foreign travelers, especially English and French, spread throughout Europe descriptions of inquisitorial prisons, autos da fe, and practices of censorship, reinforcing the image of an archaic and cruel institution. These reports fueled the Black Legend, but also reflected the clash between emerging values of tolerance and the persistence of religious repression. The Inquisition thus became a privileged target of Enlightenment criticism, which presented it as the antithesis of modernity. Despite intellectual and political pressure, the institution resisted for some decades, partially adapting. By the end of the 18th century, public auto da fe had practically disappeared, replaced by more discreet ceremonies. The censorship of books continued, but faced increasing difficulties in containing the diffusion of Enlightenment and revolutionary ideas. Inquisitorial trials became less frequent and less severe, revealing an institution that, although still present, no longer had the same repressive effectiveness. In summary, the Enlightenment represented the hardest blow against the legitimacy of the Inquisition. Philosophical questioning, legal reforms, and the secularization of justice eroded its foundations of authority. The tribunal, which for centuries had symbolized the union between faith and power, became a target of ridicule and a symbol of backwardness. This crisis did not result in its immediate abolition, but it prepared the ground for its definitive dissolution in the 19th century, when political and cultural modernity no longer admitted the survival of a tribunal dedicated to the repression of conscience. The end of the Inquisition did not occur suddenly, but was the result of a gradual process of political, cultural, and institutional decline that intensified between the 18th and 19th centuries. Enlightenment reforms, external pressures, changes in the balance between church and state, and the consolidation of new legal and political values eroded the foundations of legitimacy of the Holy Office. When it was finally abolished in Portugal in 1821 and in Spain in 1834, the institution had already lost much of its repressive strength, although it still maintained formal structures of operation. The official dissolution represented not only the closing of an era, but also the beginning of a debate on the fate of its buildings, assets, and, above all, its archives. In Portugal, the extinction of the Holy Office occurred in the context of the Liberal Revolution of Porto in 1820, which demanded constitutional reforms and the end of institutions seen as symbols of absolutism. The decree of abolition was promulgated in 1821, officially ending almost 3 centuries of activity. The inquisitorial buildings, such as the tribunals of Lisbon, Coimbra, and Évora, were deactivated, and part of their assets was incorporated into the state's patrimony. The decision reflected not only the victory of political liberalism, but also the realization that the Inquisition no longer had a place in a legal system that claimed to be modern and based on principles of freedom and civil equality. In Spain, the process was longer and more turbulent. During the reign of Charles IV at the end of the 18th century, there were already pressures to limit the tribunal, but the resistance of conservative sectors ensured its survival. In 1808, with the Napoleonic invasion and the imposition of the Constitution of Bayonne, the Inquisition was provisionally suspended. However, the absolutist restoration of Ferdinand VII in 1814 reinstated the institution. Only in 1834, during the regency of Maria Cristina, in the context of the advance of liberalism and the consolidation of the constitutional state, was definitive abolition decreed. This late end reveals how the Holy Office still found defenders in a Spain marked by strong tensions between progressive and conservative forces. The dismantling of the physical structures of the Inquisition had visible effects. The buildings that had served as tribunals and prisons were transformed into common prisons, public offices, or simply abandoned. The inquisitorial symbols, such as sanbenitos and liturgical objects used in autos da fe, were dispersed or destroyed. The dissolution of the institution left urban and architectural marks, but at the same time opened space for new legal institutions to be established in its place. The fate of the archives was one of the most important aspects of the abolition. In Portugal, much of the documentation was transferred to the Torre do Tombo in Lisbon, where it remains today as one of the most extensive collections on the history of the Inquisition. These records, consisting of trials, denunciations, letters, and reports, became a fundamental source for historians, allowing them to reconstruct daily life, popular religiosity, and strategies of repression. In Spain, the inquisitorial archives were likewise largely preserved, being incorporated into state institutions, such as the National Historical Archive in Madrid. Access to these documents had profound effects on the memory of the Inquisition. The publication of catalogues, transcriptions, and studies from the 19th century onwards fueled academic and public interest in the institution. At the same time, the preservation of the archives allowed the Inquisition to continue exerting cultural influence even after its abolition, since the stories of defendants, accusations, and sentences continued to be reconstructed and disseminated. The survival of this documentation transformed the Holy Office into a privileged object of historical research, ensuring that its memory was not erased with the end of its institutional existence. In summary, the extinction of the Inquisition in Portugal in 1821 and in Spain in 1834 marked the collapse of one of the most enduring institutions of modern history. Its dismantling reflected the triumph of liberal values and the consolidation of the constitutional state, but it also left as legacy repurposed buildings, dispersed assets, and preserved archives that continue to influence our understanding of the period. The institutional end did not erase its presence. On the contrary, it paved the way for the Inquisition to exist in the realm of memory and history, becoming an object of criticism, study, and cultural representation. The 1960s marked a decisive change in the long history of the Holy Office, After centuries of acting as guardian of orthodoxy and as a repressive tribunal, the institution underwent a profound transformation, the direct result of the Second Vatican Council and the new cultural and religious context that was emerging in the modern world. The tribunal that was born in 1542 as the Congregation of the Holy Office, heir of the Roman Inquisition, was reformulated in 1965 by Pope Paul VI, receiving the new name of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. This change was not merely terminological, but symbolized a doctrinal and pastoral reorientation, distancing the institution from the logic of judicial repression and bringing it closer to the work of theological supervision. The change of name aimed to break with the heavy historical legacy of the term Holy Office, associated in the collective imagination with the fires, prisons, and censorship. The new designation sought to communicate that the central mission was no longer to punish heresies with instruments of coercion, but to promote sound doctrine within the Catholic Church. This alteration was part of the strategy of the Second Vatican Council to update ecclesiastical language and structures, opening space for greater dialogue with the modern world. The doctrinal reorientation was equally significant. Instead of functioning as an inquisitorial tribunal, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith began to act as an organ for the analysis and approval of theological documents, the supervision of publications, and the monitoring of internal debates in the Church. Its focus shifted from punishment to clarification, from repression to guidance. Although it remained vigilant over possible doctrinal deviations, it no longer had prisons nor promoted criminal processes, but issued instructions, warnings, and opinions of a pastoral and administrative nature. In this new framework, the issue of freedom of conscience became central. The Second Vatican Council, in its declaration Dignitatis Humanae of 1965, explicitly recognized the right of every person to religious freedom. This principle represented a rupture with centuries of tradition in which the Church had tolerated or even promoted coercion in matters of faith. The old inquisitorial logic, according to which heresy should be fought as a social crime, gave way to the conviction that adherence to faith must be the fruit of individual freedom. The transformation of the Roman Holy Office also reflected broader changes in the relationship between church and society. In the post-war context, with the rise of human rights and the consolidation of democratic regimes, the maintenance of an institution associated with repression was unsustainable. The restructuring of the congregation demonstrated the Church's effort to respond to these pressures, preserving concern with orthodoxy but renouncing the coercive methods that had marked its activity for centuries. This did not mean, however, the end of controversies. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith continued to intervene in sensitive debates, such as discussions on liberation theology in Latin America, positions on sexual morality and bioethics, and interpretations of the liturgy. Even without the repressive instruments of the Inquisition, it remained a body of doctrinal vigilance, provoking criticism from sectors that saw in it the persistence of a spirit of control. At the same time, defenders claimed that its mission was necessary to guarantee the unity and identity of the Catholic faith. In historical perspective, the transformation of the 1960s marks the passage of the Inquisition into a new stage. From a feared tribunal associated with prisons and fire, the institution became an administrative congregation inserted into the logic of dialogue and pastoral supervision of the contemporary world. This change symbolizes both the Church's ability to adapt to new demands and its difficulty in dealing with the weight of its repressive past. Today, debates on freedom of conscience, religious pluralism, and individual rights continue to evoke the memory of the Inquisition, contrasting it with the current reality of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The name changed, the functions were transformed, but the heritage remains as an uncomfortable reminder of centuries in which faith and repression walked together. The contemporary challenge of the Church is precisely to maintain the balance between the defense of orthodoxy and respect for fundamental freedoms, learning from history in order not to repeat the errors that marked its long trajectory. The knowledge we have today about the Inquisition is largely due to the preservation of its archives. The institution, marked by strong bureaucracy, recorded in detail the procedures, from the initial denunciation to the execution of the sentence. This documentary obsession, typical of modern ecclesiastical administration, left behind a legacy of thousands of trials, books of confessions, reports, and correspondence, which constitute one of the richest sets of documents in European and colonial history. These records make it possible to reconstruct not only the structure of the Holy Office, but also the daily life of its defendants, their anxieties, defense strategies, and social networks. The inquisitorial trials are the main source. Each trial gathered denunciations, interrogations, opinions of consultants, the defense of the defendant, the sentence, and records of the execution of the penalty. These documents followed rigid legal formulas, but in them also appear the voices of the accused, albeit mediated by the notary's pens. The confessions obtained under pressure reveal how the defendants negotiated with the inquisitors, sometimes admitting practices to seek clemency, sometimes persistently denying the accusations. For historians, these trials are privileged windows to understand religious mentalities, collective fears, and social conflicts of the time. The books of confessions and visitation reports complement this documentation. During inquisitorial campaigns in towns and cities, visitors collected statements from residents, recording practices of faith, public confessions, and accusations of heresy. These books make it possible to map the reach of the Holy Office in areas far from major urban centers, showing how surveillance extended even into rural and colonial spaces. In addition, they provide information on customs, popular devotions, syncretic beliefs, and even neighborhood conflicts that turned into accusations of heresy, witchcraft, or superstition. The catalogues published over the centuries, especially the indexes of prohibited books, constitute another fundamental source. With each new edition of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, an updated portrait of the ideas and authors considered dangerous appeared. These catalogues show not only official censorship, but also the intellectual boundaries of orthodoxy. By studying the works included or removed from the index, it is possible to follow the evolution of the Church's concerns in the face of Europe's cultural transformations, from the Protestant Reformation to the Enlightenment. With the abolition of the Inquisition in the 19th century, the archives were transferred to state institutions. In Portugal, the Torre do Tombo in Lisbon became the guardian of a vast collection of inquisitorial trials, today consulted by researchers from all over the world. In Spain, the documents were gathered in the National Historical Archive in Madrid. These archives, progressively opened to consultation, allowed modern historiography to deconstruct myths and establish new interpretations of the Inquisition. In the 20th and early 21st centuries, digitization projects further expanded access. Today, many collections are available on digital platforms, allowing scholars in different countries to directly consult manuscripts and transcriptions. This process of documentary democratization opened the way for comparative research, broadening knowledge about the diversity of inquisitorial practices in different geographic contexts. One of the most relevant aspects of contemporary historiographical work is the attempt to recover the voices of the defendants. Even mediated by official writing, confessions, petitions, and letters reveal feelings of fear, strategies of survival, and personal visions of faith. Likewise, the reports of inquisitors show the mentality of the judges, their concerns with religious discipline, and their strategies of repression. The crossing of these two perspectives makes it possible to reconstruct not only the institution, but also the human experiences that it shaped and destroyed. In summary, the inquisitorial archives are both product and testimony of repression. Created to monitor, punish, and control, they became privileged sources for understanding the cultural and social history of the early modern period. Through trials, books of confessions, catalogues, and digital collections, researchers can today reconstruct, with density and nuance, the voices of inquisitors and defendants, revealing the complexity of an institution that profoundly marked the history of the West. The construction of an extensive script about the Inquisition, designed to last more than 3 hours, requires not only historical rigor, but also a narrative methodology capable of keeping the listener or viewer attentive throughout the journey. The proposal is not simply to list facts or accumulate information, but to organize them in a sequence that combines clarity, rhythm, and density. The narrative must advance calmly, with controlled cadence, allowing the audience to assimilate each theme without falling into unnecessary repetitions or digressions that would harm fluidity. The first fundamental resource is calm and dense progression. This means that each topic must be explored in depth, with detailed explanations and contextualizations, but presented at a steady pace without haste. The listener must feel that they are being guided safely through a continuous line of reasoning without abrupt cuts. Density is built with rich descriptions, interpretative analyses, and concrete examples, always anchored in historical sources. This balance between depth and calm narration is the key to holding attention in long-duration content. Another essential element is the alternation between specific cases and broader analysis. Examples such as the trial of Galileo, the execution of Giordano Bruno, or the experience of women accused of witchcraft provide vividness and human closeness to the narrative. After presenting these cases, the script must broaden the perspective, explaining what they reveal about the structure of the Inquisition, its practices of censorship, its relationship with secular power, or its cultural impact. This alternation between individual history and systemic analysis creates movement and avoids monotony or excessive abstraction. The organization of blocks is also decisive. In scripts of this length, each section must have a clear beginning, development, and conclusion, functioning as small chapters within the larger story. This division gives the listener points of pause and mental resumption, helping to maintain concentration. The transition from one theme to another must be smooth, through logical connections that show continuity. For example, from the study of the index of prohibited books to the auto da fe, or from inquisitorial prisons to the defense of the accused. This narrative stitching creates the feeling of unity, even in a long script. Controlled repetition is another important resource. Instead of repeating information literally, the script can revisit ideas in new contexts, reinforcing the listener's memory. For example, when discussing book censorship, it is possible to briefly recall how it related to surveillance over universities, or when speaking of autos da fe, to refer to the theatricality of secular power. This technique strengthens retention without falling into redundancy. The narrative rhythm can be maintained with variation of intensity. There are moments when the narrative should be more descriptive, detailing the daily life of prisons or the sequence of a public ritual. In others, it should take on a more reflective tone, examining the political legitimacy of the Holy Office or Enlightenment criticism. This oscillation prevents monotony and stimulates attention, creating peaks of interest within a calm cadence. Another relevant point is the controlled use of guided imagination. Without resorting to fiction, the script can invite the listener to visualize environments, such as the silence of a damp cell, the crowd gathered at an auto da fe, or the symbolic weight of a San Benito. These sensory descriptions, anchored in historical sources, increase the emotional impact of the narrative and facilitate immersion. The secret is to use this resource sparingly and in balance, always in the service of historical understanding. Finally, the central strategy is the construction of a narrative line that moves from the particular to the universal, from detail to broad interpretation, keeping the listener in constant expectation. Each block must offer not only information, but also reflections that dialogue with larger questions: power, faith, freedom, intolerance. In this way, the script goes beyond simple factual exposition and becomes a prolonged intellectual and emotional experience. In summary, the narrative methodology of a script lasting more than 3 hours about the Inquisition must combine calm progression, informative density, alternation between cases and analyses, clear divisions, controlled repetitions, variation of intensity, and sparing use of sensory descriptions. This set of techniques ensures that the audience's attention is maintained, that the narrative becomes engaging, and that the listening or viewing experience is prolonged without wear, allowing the complexity of the subject to be explored in all its depth. The soundtrack plays a fundamental role in building immersion in long scripts about the Inquisition. Given the theme's historical depth and symbolic weight, it requires a sound treatment that balances sobriety and atmosphere, avoiding dramatic excesses that could distract from the content. Music and background sounds must function as subtle layers, reinforcing the narrative climate and guiding the listener on their journey, without ever overshadowing the main voice. The choice of carefully designed soundscapes ensures not only greater retention, but also a listening experience that approaches a sensory encounter with the past. Monastic ambience is one of the most effective elements. Sounds that evoke cloisters, stone corridors, and the slow cadence of footsteps echoing in enclosed spaces help create a backdrop that transports the listener to the world of the Holy Office. The soft tolling of distant bells, the echo of liturgical chants in Latin, and the sound of burning candles can be discreetly used to reinforce the spiritual and institutional weight of the narrative. This atmosphere creates contrast with quieter moments, where the absence of sound conveys the sense of isolation and waiting, typical of inquisitorial prisons. Urban sounds of the Iberian Peninsula also contribute to historical contextualization. Bustling markets, voices in narrow streets, horses and carriages, street cries and church bells can be inserted in a controlled way to place the listener in the social space where the Inquisition unfolded. This layer of realism connects inquisitorial repression to everyday life in the cities, reminding us that autos da fe, censorship and imprisonments did not occur in isolation, but before entire societies that witnessed and internalized religious discipline. Discrete choirs are another powerful resource. Male or female choirs chanting Gregorian hymns in low volume reinforce the gravity of the theme, evoking the spiritual dimension of ceremonies. This choral music, used sparingly, can accompany passages dealing with liturgies, sermons, and autos da fe, not turning the narrative into a spectacle, but creating a background of solemnity that resonates with the religious nature of the institution. The simplicity and rhythmic repetition of the chants favor concentration and heighten the sense of temporal immersion. The use of ancient instruments enhances this atmosphere. Lutes, viols, portable organs, and Renaissance flutes may appear in specific passages, suggesting the soundscape of the era. These instruments, played slowly and discreetly, function as markers of transition between sections or as light accompaniment in descriptions of rituals and ceremonies. The goal is not to create elaborate melodies, but to reinforce the historical tone, reminding the listener that they are immersed in a distant time. Controlled pauses complete the strategy. In long scripts, silence has as much impact as music. Planned pauses with no sound or with almost imperceptible noises give space for reflection and the processing of information. This resource can be used, for example, after the description of an execution in an auto da fe, or at the end of a section on prisons and confessions, allowing the emotional weight of the content to be absorbed before continuing. Thus, the soundtrack and soundscapes throughout the script must balance monastic ambience, urban sounds, discrete choirs, ancient instruments, and carefully placed pauses. The result is an experience that unites historical narrative and sensory immersion, sustaining attention for hours without exhausting the listener. Each sound layer reinforces the density of the content, transporting the audience into the spiritual, social, and political atmosphere of the inquisitorial era without compromising informational clarity. The Inquisition, over more than 3 centuries of activity, left deep marks that go beyond its time and remain alive in cultural memory. The tribunal was not only a mechanism of religious repression, but also a system that shaped behaviors, limited the circulation of ideas, and served as a political instrument for monarchies and for the Church. Its longevity shows the effectiveness of an institution that knew how to adapt to different historical contexts, while projecting fear and discipline over entire societies. Even today, the word Inquisition evokes images of intolerance, persecution, and violence, becoming a universal metaphor to describe systems of oppression. The historical legacy of the Holy Office can be seen in different dimensions. In the religious field, the Inquisition consolidated a rigid orthodoxy that helped the Catholic Church survive the crises of the Reformation and the early modern era. In the political field, it served as support for absolute monarchies, reinforcing centralization and the union between throne and altar. In the cultural field, it limited the diffusion of scientific, philosophical, and literary ideas, delaying, in certain contexts, the assimilation of modernity. At the same time, it left vast archives that today make it possible to reconstruct silenced voices, showing how repression also produced memory. The lessons about intolerance and social control are evident. The Inquisition demonstrated how the combination of faith and political power can generate highly effective systems of coercion. It also showed how fear, when turned into public spectacle, as in the autos da fe, can become an instrument of collective discipline. and it highlighted the fragility of individual freedoms when confronted with institutions that seek to control consciences. These lessons, when revisited, help us to understand not only the past, but also contemporary mechanisms of ideological and cultural repression. The cultural memory of the Inquisition was nurtured by diverse narratives. The Black Legend, built by Protestant and Enlightenment propaganda, amplified its image of cruelty, transforming the Holy Office into the ultimate example of obscurantism. Catholic apologies, on the other hand, sought to relativize its violence, presenting it as a tribunal more moderate than others of its time. Literature, cinema, and popular culture perpetuated these images, sometimes reinforcing the horror, sometimes exploring the fascination with secrecy and shadow. Thus, the Inquisition remains not only as a historical fact, but also as a cultural symbol in dispute. Its permanence in the collective imagination shows how certain institutions transcend the time in which they existed. Although abolished in the 19th century, the Inquisition continues to be evoked in debates on religious intolerance, censorship, and political persecution. The expression witch hunt has become a universal metaphor to describe unjust persecutions in different contexts, from McCarthyism in the United States to contemporary disputes on social media. This persistence shows that the inquisitorial past still dialogues with present dilemmas. To conclude, such an extensive script about the Inquisition means recognizing that its legacy lies not only in the number of trials or in the fires that marked its history, but also in the ways the institution shaped Western culture and how its memory continues to be mobilized. The conclusion must remain open, inviting the listener to reflect on the dangers of intolerance, on the temptation of social control, and on the importance of freedom of conscience. More than a closing, it is an invitation to constant vigilance, reminding us that the history of the Inquisition, with all its horrors and contradictions, does not belong only to the past, but remains a warning for the present and the future.